One day, a strange book appeared in a young lady's dream. Tervian Halvankia was the main character in it, the terrible, destructive love of a war-mad man. Throughout the entire work, he treated the heroine as if he were not a human being at all. She looked at him intently and said that he knew nothing about love. He only said with a grin that it was funny. He ended up getting killed at the end of the book, and the young lady was just an extra with a few lines. A half-blood princess born from the romance of a king and a servant who spent her entire life imprisoned in a castle. At the beginning of the story, she was sent to Halvankia, and she lost her life before the beginning of the story. But now she had no intention of dying at all. Tervian was surprised, because the king first started the war, and as soon as he lost several castles, he sent him the princess of his state to stop the war. He looked at the princess intently and told her to state her name. The young lady quietly said her name and said that her name was Alexia Anzac. Looking at her, he asked her with a smirk what her thoughts were on this matter. He said that her father was just an incompetent fool. Alexia S. said that at the moment, this statement is unacceptable in relation to the ruler of the state. He walked slowly towards her, and with fury in his eyes, said that she should look at him and say it again. She looked at him steadily and said that her answer was not changed. For the king had been reckless, and many had lost their lives because of the needless war. The young man was surprised and was interested in the fact that the king's daughter was criticizing him. The young lady looked at him intently and wondered if there was still a chance that he would make a pact with that fool. I knew that in the book, he was the one who laughed while he killed someone like it meant nothing to him. She was very worried and wondered if this would be the end for her. She knew she could die now, but there was no such thing in the book. He said that he seemed to understand why the king had sent her. She already knew it, since she was a princess after death. Nothing would change for her. He looked at the young lady intently and asked her with a smile if she liked him. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was the only unmarried member of the family. He asked if she didn't like him. The young lady, trembling with fear, looked at him in surprise. She did not know what to answer and did not know how to behave in this situation. With lightning speed, the young man embraced the young lady and breathed a sigh of relief. He said with a satisfied smile that it seemed like they both only needed one thing. The young lady in turn apologized, as she did not understand what he was talking about. His aura was pressing on her, and she felt like she was going to throw up. All the people who were sent here were people who were abandoned. He said they should get married next month. The young lady was in shock. She knew that she couldn't lose everything, only because of this. She exhaled heavily and agreed with him. He looked at her intently and said that if she was so obedient, she must answer him before she would like him. He said that knowing about her kingdom, she would become a traitor. She said that they themselves were to blame since they sent her away. She looked at the prince and said that for this reason, she didn't care how she accepted her death. And besides, she liked him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what exactly she liked about him. She said it was his face and his voice, and also his knowledge. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked her if she liked his face, since he knew it was fearsome. He thought she was making fun of him. The young lady in turn said that she was not lying to him. He said that was enough, and now she should follow him, as he would escort her to the room. The young lady in turn followed him slowly, but a moment later she saw blood on his hand. He sighed heavily and said that it was not his blood, and she should not worry. With a trembling voice, she asked whose blood it was. He looked at her with a fake smile, but said nothing. A moment later, he asked the lady if she was afraid of him. She sighed heavily, and looking at his hand, said that it was not so since she was only worried about him earlier. A moment later, the young lady took her ribbon and bandaged his hand. He pulled her into the room in a hurry. She apologized, said that he needed to change the bandage later. He said that it was not necessary. He sighed heavily and said that she exceeded all his expectations. She asked if he didn't like it. The young man said that it was not so. As he entered the room, he looked at her and said that if she wanted to survive in a place like this, she needed to prove her worth. The young lady was wary. She did not understand why he did not leave and continued to stare at her. She exhaled heavily and felt sad, because she thought he was looking at her jet-black hair. She knew that this was the color of a witch. Without looking at the young man, she said that they looked very similar, very terrible. The young man said that it was not so. For a moment he thought, but a few minutes later, looking at the young lady, he said that her hair was like night. She froze in surprise as she had never heard anything like that before. She noticed that everything inside the room was ascetic, like in a temple, a bed and a wardrobe, as well as a single bookshelf. The king told the lady that she would be sent to Halvankia. She looked at him intently and asked what would happen if she refused. The king said that her mother needed a doctor. He looked at the lady closely and asked if she still wanted to refuse. She asked if he would kill her if she refused. The king said she need not worry, but he would still kill her. The king looked at her mockingly and asked if she really wanted to leave her to die. He said that if she succeeded, he would treat her like a real princess. She said she still didn't agree. Alexia looked at him intently and said that if she agreed, then he should let her mother and her go, and he would not look for them again. The king looked at the young lady intently and still agreed. He said that he gave her his word. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly in her room. She looked closely at her decoration, for she knew that she must succeed in what she had planned. A moment later, she heard a knock at the door and gave her permission to enter the room. A few minutes later, a girl looked into the princess's room. The princess looked at her and told her to leave everything, and she would do everything. The girl apologized and said that it was her job. She noticed that the child had a scar. The girl looked at the princess with glassy eyes and said that her scar was simply disgusting. The princess realized that the girl had come to her to show her her scar. She asked the girl if it was really the army that had done this. The girl said that they set her house on fire, and unfortunately, her entire family died in it because they could not get out. The princess was in shock. The princess, frozen in shock, asked the girl for forgiveness, screamed with rage, and said that she wanted all the people from Anzaki to die. The princess looked closely at the young girl and asked for forgiveness. She came closer to her and asked if the girl had heard of the Insidria flower. With tears in her eyes, the girl said that she had heard of it. The princess smiled and said that if you use this flower, you can get rid of the scar, since her burn also disappeared after this use. The princess smiled and extended her hand to the girl, saying that everything was fine and that she could touch it. Anila looked timidly at the princess and asked if it would help her face. The princess looked at the girl with a soft smile and said that she would definitely get better. She knew she could hardly erase the wounds of the past, but she wanted to change the life of at least one child. The princess was sleeping quietly in the room when she suddenly heard a scream. Kiliasar woke up the princess. She was surprised that she had gone to bed in clothes not intended for sleeping. The princess said that she would be more careful. She looked at the princess intently and said that today she would be her instructor. She was one of Turvian's loyal subjects. The princess really liked this girl who was constantly trying to protect him. Kili looked at the princess with disdain. The princess looked at her intently, as she really wanted to be on good terms with her. Anzaki alive! The princess sighed heavily and said that she knew that there was no one here who would treat her well. Kili was glad that the princess understood this. The princess looked at her intently, as she knew that she desperately wanted to know why she was still alive. But she was also curious. A moment later, she handed the glass of water to the princess, who thanked her. The princess slowly began to drink the contents. Kili looked at the princess with a haughty grin. A moment later, she told the princess that she was very brave, for she drank the water, knowing that she might have mixed something into it. The princess told her that if she wanted to kill her, she could do it at any time. Kili said that she was ordered to do everything so that not a single hair would fall from her. She looked at the princess with disdain and said that if she did something outrageous, she would definitely pay for it. She slowly poured water on the flower that stood in the room, and it lost its shine. The princess calmly said that she would not do anything. A moment later, she told the princess that it was time for them to go, and that she had to change her clothes. She looked at the princess and her clothes in surprise. Since she did not understand why they looked like that, she asked if she liked this outfit. Kili sighed heavily, and looking at the princess, said that it looked like she took it by mistake. The man looked at His Highness and called him over. Ludwig asked if it was true that he wanted to marry the princess. Turvian S. said that everything was exactly like that. He understood his choice perfectly well, since it did not depend on him. But still, Ludwig said that if he were to commit such rash acts, then His Majesty might lose his trust in him. Ludwig was afraid that the prince might be imprisoned. Turvian said that he would not allow this to happen, since he was no longer a stupid child. Ludwig said he knew it, but he was still worried. He understood everything perfectly, but now the prince looked like a real monster. He sighed heavily and said that he needed more time, because the more he used the power, the more it ate him up from the inside. Ludwig told the master that he would always be with him. He also said that he must go to Landquart. The prince looked at his secretary in surprise and asked if he was really leaving today. Ludwig sighed heavily and said that he seemed to have forgotten, but due to his health problems, today was the day he had to go get his medicine. The prince told his subordinate not to worry about him, but to take better care of himself. The prince told him to keep his hopes to himself. Ludwig, in turn, mentally asked the prince to remain safe and sound until his return. Keely looked at the princess intently and said that she was only explaining everything once, and so she should listen carefully. She said that the 4th floor is where guests like the princess stay, and the 3rd floor is where His Highness's private quarters are. She asked the princess not to go there. She looked at the princess intently and told her not to wander around the castle, as there were many crazy people who wanted to harm her. She looked at the princess with a smirk and asked if she really thought that a sane person would try to kill someone here. A moment later, she said with a smile that the strangest man was the king who started the war and then sent his princess to them. She asked if they really thought that this would start a war. The princess said indifferently that they knew that it wouldn't help. Keely looked at the princess and asked if a man who thought so would get rid of his daughter. The princess of the indifferent sighed heavily and said that the king was such a person. Turning around, she said that she was not at all interested in the history of the princess's family. He glanced sideways at the princess. She said that there were a lot of psychos in the castle, and therefore she should behave well. Keely blocked the princess and did not let her pass. She said that she would wait a little and did not leave her side. All the knights present were shocked. They could not understand why a murderer like the princess was now in the castle. The young lady was shocked. She thought she would be hated, but not to this extent. The young man looked at them with fury and said that he would like to look her straight in the face. She looked intently at everyone present and said that His Majesty had given the order to give the princess a tour. The man was furious. He screamed that he would just kill her right now. Keely in turn screamed for him to calm down, and since she was ordered to protect the princess, after a few minutes of arguing, a fight broke out between them. Keely parried the blow with ease. She looked at the man mockingly, but unfortunately, the young man caught her. She looked at him with fury and shouted that he was too noisy. Sometime later, he was already lying on the ground. She looked at him intently and asked if she could pierce his throat. He sighed heavily and said that she had become a lousy bodyguard. Keely said that there was no need to be angry with her, as she was just a little girl. He looked at the princess with fury and said that he wanted to see her suffer. The princess was shocked. She looked at him intently as she realized that he also lost someone dear in the war. Keely looked at everyone present with fury and said that the performance was already over and they should return to training. The princess looked closely at the girl and said that she was bleeding. Keely looked at the princess intently and told her not to walk alone, as everyone wanted to kill her. The princess looked at her intently and thanked her. Keely asked in surprise what she thanked her for. The princess looked at her with a sweet smile and said that she wanted to thank her for protecting her. Keely said it was an order, and she was following it. Looking at the princess, she realized that she did not look like an ordinary princess. The young lady, in turn, knew that she was being very sweet when she said such a thing. A moment later, she felt that there was someone outside. She heard someone's voice. She heard a man's voice and realized that it was the guy with whom Keely had fought today. He said angrily that the princess was going to die soon, and they could just speed up the process. He shouted furiously that she was the daughter of that bastard he wanted to kill her. The young lady became wary. She did not know what to do. She knew perfectly well that she had to hide on the balcony first. She wondered what would happen if she screamed. She didn't know if anyone would help her. The man entered the room. He was surprised, because he did not notice her. His companion said that the bed was still warm, and she was definitely somewhere in the room. She was scared. She knew that she had to hide where she would not be found. She quietly climbed over the balcony railings. She quietly hung on them. The man, having examined the balcony, said that she was not there. His friend was surprised, because he did not understand where she could have run away to. They looked for her in the room while she was hanging. The young man said that it looked like someone had moved the flower pot. She froze in shock as she realized that they were going to find her now. The princess froze in fear as she heard someone approaching her, but they still did not reach her as time was running out. The princess did not hear whether they had left or not. She wanted to get up, but unfortunately, she stumbled while getting up. Unable to hold herself back, Princess O let go of the handrail and fell to the ground with lightning speed. She could not believe that she was about to die. The princess froze in shock and opened her eyes, seeing the prince in front of her. He asked in surprise what she was doing here. She didn't know what to answer. He looked at her with fury and said that it was the first time he had seen such a terrible attempt to meet him. He sighed heavily and said that he thought she wanted to commit suicide. She said that it was not so, and thanked him for saving her, but he relentlessly asked her about suicide. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said that he was asking her why she had not called the guards. He asked angrily if she really thought that if she ran away and crashed to her death, she would be able to take revenge. She screamed that he knew everything, but didn't come to save her. Alexia asked if he really wanted to kiss her corpse. He said he didn't have such a hobby. She asked if he really wanted to find himself another princess. He asked in surprise if they had another princess. He didn't understand why she behaved like that. She looked at him with fury and said that she did not know how he managed to catch her, but still asked him to accept her gratitude. A moment later, he ordered a servant to call the doctor. The princess said that she would wait in her room. The prince agreed with her and wanted to take her, but she said that she would go there herself. The prince looked at the princess intently and said that next time she should call the guards. She looked at him with a smirk. She didn't understand how he could be sure that the guards themselves wouldn't kill her. The princess was puzzled by the fact that she had to think all the time about the fact that she could be killed. She knew that her life here was no different from before. A moment later, the doctor entered her room and greeted her. The doctor examined the princess with lightning speed and showed her that he was the first person who did not hate her. The princess looked at the doctor intently and asked if he knew where she could find insidra leaves. She said it was not for her, as she had met a little girl. The doctor asked if she meant Anila. He said that he uses a flower and mixes it with the ointment he uses. Alexia asked if he was really treating the girl. The doctor said that he treats everyone in the castle, be it an orphan or a princess. She smiled and gave him a recipe for a healing ointment. The princess said that she had cured her hand with the help of this recipe. The doctor, puzzled, told the princess that she made him feel awkward. The princess looked at him in surprise and said that she had not meant to offend him at all. He said that he had all the medicinal herbs she had mentioned. He looked at her in surprise and said that she knew a lot about herbs, and it was amazing. The princess sheepishly said that she simply had to learn how to use them. It was all because of her mother. For some time, the princess told the doctor about all the herbs and their meanings. The doctor listened to her attentively. A moment later, the doctor bowed with a smile and said that he had learned a lot, and it had been a pleasure talking to her. The princess looked after him intently. She knew that a long time had passed since she had had a normal conversation with someone. A moment later, a man entered the room and said that if her examination was over, she needed to have something to eat. The servant brought the princess dinner and told her to enjoy her meal. She was glad because he came on time. The young lady slowly touched the food. As soon as she tasted the dish, she felt sick. The knight shouted to the prince that he was very sorry for what he had done. The prince angrily asked the man what the order was. Suffering from pain, the knight said that he had to leave the princess alone. The prince screamed in rage that the knight had disobeyed him. Trembling with pain, the knight said that he still could not kill her. The prince struck the knight with fury. He shouted that he was telling him, right now, about his worthlessness. He said that he did not need such people. A moment later, the knight pounced on the prince. He knew he couldn't just die like that. He was furious because he could not take revenge on the king. He attacked the prince with all his anger. But a moment later, the prince fought him off and struck him, and he fell to the ground with a crash. The prince in turn looked intently at the knight, for he knew that he lived for the sake of killing the king. He looked at the young man closely and said that he would grant him a dignified death. The knight accepted death with honor. The servant brought the princess her food. She was shocked and wondered if they really ate anything here except meat. She felt very nauseous. She couldn't eat anything like that because she couldn't stand the smell of blood. Unfortunately, she had been through a lot, and now she thought that everything would be okay with her, but unfortunately, it was all in vain. Alexia was in shock because she knew that in such a place she was completely alone and everyone wanted to kill her. The servant excitedly asked the princess if she was okay. Sighing heavily, the princess said that she was not okay. The servant ran away in a hurry and said that he would now bring other food. The princess was puzzled. She didn't know if she would be able to get to the bed. Unfortunately, she was losing consciousness. A moment later, she fell to the ground with a thud, unconscious. The prince entered the room and froze in place. He did not understand what was happening at all. The servant shouted that it was because of the princess's food. The prince tasted the food prepared for the princess with lightning speed. He looked at everyone present in surprise and shouted that he was not poisoned. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked why she wasn't eating anything. She said that she couldn't. He looked at her puzzledly and asked if she would rather die before marrying him. Trembling, she said that she loved him. The prince froze in shock. Treason, frozen in surprise, asked what she was talking about. She looked at him and said that she had already told him that she loved him. The prince froze in surprise on the spot. The prince looked intently at Her Highness and asked if she had called him. She looked at him intently and said, "Treason. He wants to marry the princess." She asked the prince if he was not disappointed since that boy was aiming for his place. He said that she shouldn't worry about it, since all the nobility was on her mother's side. She said that they must do everything to ensure their future, and he must go there and know about everything. He said that the queen was not feeling well, and until she got better, he would not go anywhere. She sighed heavily and said that the queen would recover without his presence. She said furiously that if only he could handle a sword, everything would be much easier. He sighed heavily and wondered where the man who had told him to concentrate on politics had gone. He was puzzled that she could not give birth to another child. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was throwing a tantrum at her. With lightning speed, he began to pace the room and mock her. She was furious and screamed at him to stop. She sighed heavily, as she did not understand how she could have given birth to such an ill-mannered brat. She ordered the servants to prepare him for dispatch. The young lady slowly opened her eyes. She woke up and saw the prince in front of her. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. She watched him for a while. She looked at him in surprise and called out. The prince sighed heavily and asked if she had woken up yet. He slowly reached out to her, but the princess became wary. He said that it seemed she did not have a fever. A moment later, a servant entered the room and called the princess. He brought her soup. The princess looked at the prince with a smile and thanked him for the wonderful soup. He asked in surprise if that was all she had eaten in. She was already full, but the prince still insisted that she eat more. She sighed heavily as she felt like her stomach was about to burst. The prince looked at her intently and held out a glass. She asked in surprise what was in it. He said that she should not complain. The servant looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was just medicine. She became wary but still began to drink. The princess noticed that it was very bitter. The prince introduced the princess to a new servant, and he also told her to stop stalling, since she could ask him for anything she wanted. She imagined it looked at him and asked, even if she said something, would they help her before she died? The prince was shocked. He left the room with lightning speed without saying anything. The servant said that the prince was very busy, and therefore he could disappear for a long time. The princess slowly turned around and quietly thanked the servant for everything he had done for her. He smiled and said that there was nothing to thank him for. She became wary because she heard a familiar voice. The young man looked at the princess and said that she needed to be patient for a little while because he would definitely bring her home. He looked at her intently and said that he swears by his name and by the title of White Knight. She was sure that he was also one of the spies. The princess jumped up and called the servant. The girl looked intently at her companion and said that the princess would never return home again. She said that he seemed to be too busy taking care of the princess. He asked her in surprise what she meant by saying such things. She said mockingly that it seemed he was the only one who didn't know. She told him how the princess had been treated all this time. He was shocked because he had not expected such a thing. She said that the princess was called the Black Ghost because she had to eat the leftovers from the ball. They talked for a while, but a moment later, she looked at him and said that he didn't have a single cent when he was born. She didn't understand how he managed to survive in those harsh times. The princess looked into the distance and said with a smile to her servant that it seemed to be always so noisy here. He knew that the princess had lived at the very end of the palace in the past and had never seen anything like it. On the prince's orders, the servants began to move the princess's room. She looked at the man in surprise and asked if she was really moving somewhere. The servant said that everything was exactly like that, and now she would live next to the prince. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was safe there. The princess sighed heavily as she knew that most people hated her, and she was worried that something might happen to her. She asked if she could take the flower with her. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to take the dried flower pot. When she saw that pot, she remembered that the necklace she had was fraught with great danger. The servant said that she did not need to persuade you, and that she should at least use the cart. She smiled and said that everything was fine. The young lady walked down slowly as she noticed a small child in the distance. The girl looked closely at the princess and said that she heard that she was ill. The princess looked at the girl with a smile and asked if she had received the medicinal herbs, anila, that she had received everything. The princess smiled and asked if they had helped. She said that the teacher had told her that the redness had disappeared. The girl looked closely at the princess and timidly told her to get well soon. Anila looked at the princess intently and said that after her recovery, she would be able to hate her with all her heart. The young lady walked slowly into the room. She was surprised because it was very spacious. A few minutes later, she noticed someone's clothes in the closet. The servant said that he didn't know whose they were. She thought for a moment, as she thought that these were most likely gifts for her. A moment later, someone knocked on her door and said that he was going to come into the room. The doctor looked at the princess intently and with a wide smile and asked how she felt. She smiled and said that she was okay. Since she was not badly hurt, she asked if he had any business with hers. He said that he had brought her a book about medicinal herbs. The doctor asked if she already knew everything. He said with a smile that if she decided to prepare some medicine, she should drop by his office. The princess smiled and said that she would think about it. The doctor said that they could assume that he had come to tell her to get well soon. The princess remarked that he was a funny character. The young lady sat quietly on the terrace and sipped tea. She was surprised because the sky was very radiant. She sighed heavily as she wanted to know what the prince was doing now. A moment later, the prince looked closely at the young lady and asked what she was doing. She jumped as she had not expected to see him. She said that she had crushed the medicinal herbs, and the prince asked if the doctor had asked her to prepare the medicine. The princess said that this was not so, and she volunteered herself. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really doing useless work. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing there. He sighed heavily and said he was just looking at Anzac. Alexia asked in surprise if he really hated him that much. The prince sighed heavily and said that it was just an old habit. She knew that in her eyes, he was a man who did not know love. He survived at the expense of the lives of others. She hoped that in this life everything would be different for him. She sighed heavily and said that the wind was very pleasant. The prince asked her if she really liked the dress so much. He asked if there really wasn't another one. She said there were other clothes in the closet. Treason said that the clothes did not belong to anyone, and if she did not intend to wear them, she could throw them away. She looked at him intently and asked if she would have to wear it. Callie looked at the princess with a smile and asked if she would like to go for a walk. She smiled and said she wanted to freshen up a bit. She said she had finished her workout early. She looked closely at the princess and said that usually she goes to rest after her, but now she has to guard the princess. She smiled and said that the weather was very good today, and so they had better hurry before it got worse. A few minutes later, a young man ran up to them. He said that the prince was fighting with Gaster, and he was in an inappropriate form. He shouted that something very serious was about to happen, and therefore he must hurry as he wanted to see this spectacle. Keely stopped looking at the princess and asked if she wanted to look too. Sometime later, they made their way through a crowd of knights. The prince turned around and saw the Princess Alexia looked at the prince in bewilderment. All the knights present were shouting, but their noise was distracting the knight. He shouted for them all to be quiet. A moment later, the princess saw the shot and froze in place. They were surprised as the prince showed his true strength. The prince looked at the knight in surprise and asked if he hadn't said that he could dodge. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she had come. The princess, in turn, noticed that his hand was tied with her ribbon. He came closer to her and asked with fury in his eyes why she was here. Alexia was taken aback and said that she was walking around the castle and decided to look, and the prince said that the training was already over. He took the princess by the hand and pulled her. Keely said that the princess asked her to accompany him. The prince was furious, as she knew very well what kind of place this was. Keely asked the prince for forgiveness, but he angrily said that a simple apology was not enough. He said that she was free now, and he would scold her later. The princess looked at the prince in surprise and called him. The prince looked at the princess with surprise and anger. Alexia said that it was she who asked to bring her. He asked angrily if she really thought she was the mistress of the castle. She sighed and said that she had no right to do so. The prince shouted at the princess with rage, bombarding her with questions. She looked at him in surprise. The princess was taken aback and said she was Anzac, and she had no right at all. He said furiously that it didn't matter. A moment later, the prince grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him, shouting for all to hear that his bride was Alexia Anzac. He shouted furiously that whoever touched her with even a finger would die. Everyone present was in shock. They asked questions in a hurry, but the prince sighed heavily and said that they would leave all the questions for later. He dragged her along the corridor with lightning speed. The princess sighed heavily and asked him to stop. The princess sighed heavily and said that she didn't know that she wasn't allowed to watch the training. She began to justify herself, but in turn, the prince stopped her with lightning speed. He said he didn't think she could say something so embarrassing. He said she shouldn't say that to him. The prince said that she must not forget that she was in an enemy country and that she was not allowed to appear in the training hall. She said that the king had not taught her anything, and even if she watched, she would not be able to do anything. She said that she would not look at military equipment, weapons, and everything else. He sighed heavily and said that no one had thought about it. The princess looked at him in surprise. He sighed heavily and said that even when she was faced with the doctor's work, she still did not understand. He said that Callie Ann had broken his order, and there was nothing he could do about it. He took her to her room and told her that she could rest. The princess looked at him intently and asked why he didn't take it off. The prince looked closely at his hand and a moment later said that the wound was not completely healed. The princess wondered if no one could heal his wound, but she didn't mind that he wore her ribbon. The next day, Kallitak did not come, and the princess was sitting in the room. She remembered how the prince said that she had obeyed his order. She understood perfectly well that the girl had suffered because of her. Joseph walked into the room as a princess and said he needed to wash her dishes. The princess asked him if Callie was okay. He said she was just on probation for a week. The princess thought for a moment and said that she was very worried and did not know what to do. He looked at her intently and said that when the girl returned, the princess could apologize to her. The princess thought that this would not be enough. He smiled and said that, of course, that would be enough. The princess looked at him timidly and said that in that case she would try. He looked closely at the princess and asked if she would like to take a little walk. He looked at the princess with a smile and said that they were already there. The princess smiled as they found themselves in the stable. The princess slowly approached the horse as she wanted to feed it. She smiled and said that this was her first time seeing a horse in real life. She smiled and said that she would not count the one who was driving her carriage that time. A moment later, a young man approached him and said with a smile that he had already fed the horses. He looked closely at his friend and said that the princess was currently out for a walk. He looked angrily at his friend and asked if he had really brought the princess here. After the prince recently sent the knight into the forest that was teeming with monsters, no one dared to lay a finger on the princess. Joseph said that by the prince's order, they must take the princess wherever she wishes. The young man began to be indignant. Joseph glanced sideways at the princess, who was tenderly communicating with the horse. He slowly approached the princess and asked with a smile if she really liked this horse. The princess smiled and said that its fur was very dark. She smiled and said that she thought he was all alone for its dark fur. He said it was the prince's horse, and her temper was just terrible. She didn't get along with other horses. The princess smiled because she thought that the horse took after its owner in character. The young man froze in surprise and embarrassment as he saw the princess's radiant smile. The princess, in turn, looked at the servant in surprise and called him. She slowly walked closer to him and with a soft smile said that he had a straw stuck in his hair. She reached out to him. The young man ran away with the speed of lightning. He shouted that he would go clean up the horse and return. She froze in surprise, as she did not understand why he behaved in such a way. The princess looked at the horse with a smile and said that she would give it food if it came inside. The princess happily fed the horse. She was glad that the horse obeyed her. But a moment later, the horse reared up, and the princess was taken aback. The princess heard a dull crack and froze in place. She saw that just a little more, and the horse would get out of the pen. Joseph ran up to the princess with lightning speed and pushed her away while the horse ran out into the street with lightning speed. Trembling with fear, he asked if she was okay. The princess only said about the apple. The young man looked at her in surprise. The princess smiled and said that it seemed that the horse really wanted the apple. He asked if she was hurt. Alexia said she was fine, but asked what about him. The princess noticed a wound on his hand and offered to treat it, but he refused. Then she said that it was an order. The young man said sheepishly that he would do everything obediently. The princess sighed heavily, as she had not thought at all that she would also get hurt. She knew that her servant had actually suffered more than she had. A moment later, there was a knock on the door of the room. She gave her permission to enter, but was taken aback when she saw the prince. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she got hurt. The boy said he heard that there had been an accident in the stable. She showed her leg and said that nothing terrible had happened. He sighed heavily and said that she had been so worried about him before, but now she was ignoring her own. She said she was fine. She even took her medicine. The prince looked at her closely and asked if the servant had mistaken it for her. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise, as she had no idea what he was talking about. The princess looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The prince in turn looked at the young lady with fury and said that it seemed that she had recently become very close to the young man. He looked at the princess with disdain and asked if it was really his hump that provoked such a surge of sympathy in her. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand why he suddenly became angry. She said that he himself chose the young man to be her servant. "Prince, is that really why she is so kind to him?" The prince said that she is a simpleton. Alexia sighed heavily and said that she had heard that he carefully selected servants who would not treat her with hatred. The princess looked away and said that she was a little late in thanking him, but still thanked him for saving her. The prince sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he could do nothing about their hatred. She looked at the prince intently and wondered if he would hate her too. The prince looked into the distance and said that they would have to move Hans's room to the first floor. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked why he would do such a thing. A few minutes later, the prince noticed Callie. Callie looked at the prince intently and asked if he had called her. The prince told her that she should tell Hans to be moved to another room. She looked at the prince in surprise, but said that she understood everything. The princess glanced sideways at the flower that was in her room. She had only brought it inside today because it was already getting cold. The prince looked angrily at the flower and asked his subordinate what it was. She sighed heavily and timidly said that she had warned the princess. He looked at her with fury and told her to get rid of him immediately. The princess was shocked and screamed that this couldn't be done. The princess screamed and asked the prince to give her permission to keep it. The prince said that the flower had already withered. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she knew about it. He looked at her in bewilderment and said that she had very unusual preferences. Alexia looked intently at the prince and asked him to leave a flower as a reminder of her origin and place in this palace. He said angrily that she was the future wife of the House of Halvenkia. He said that she would not have a second chance. The prince asked if they could throw him out now. The princess looked at him intently and said that her answer was still negative. The prince sighed heavily. Treason said he hoped she wouldn't drag him into his room when she moved in with him. The princess said, of course she wouldn't. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he was already leaving. The prince looked at her sideways and casually asked if she had any more questions. She said that she had no questions left. He looked at her intently and said that he had rushed here from training, and he also said that her servant had been acting very strangely. The princess looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he was worried about her. He sighed heavily and, looking at the princess, said that she could think whatever she wanted. She knew that it would be very good if he worried about her of his own free will. She sighed heavily as she knew that his feelings were initially beyond her control. so it would be too much for her to desire something that did not belong to her. Without looking at the prince, she said that everything was fine and that he did not need to worry about her. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he was at least curious. He even thought for a moment why she had become so weak. She knew she was weak because she hadn't eaten anything for days. He said she was weak because she was different every time she denied it. He looked at her puzzled and said the people under his command were not like that. She was shocked and very angry at him, as she knew that all the people under his command were the best knights in the kingdom. He looked at the princess with a smile, because he was surprised by her expression. He smiled and said, "That's much better." As he was leaving, he said that he had to go back already. At the door, the prince bumped into a servant. Joseph said that dinner was ready. The prince looked at the princess and said that she should eat a little and should not faint any more. The young lady looked at the prince intently, or with a soft smile said that he must also take care of himself and the negligent person. She sighed heavily and said that all he had was a ribbon. The prince froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that from her. He slowly walked closer to her and took her hand. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that he really hoped that she would worry about him in the future. The prince kissed her hand tenderly. Killy sighed heavily and said that it seemed she had worked herself into overwork. After she met the prince, she could not even imagine that he could be so friendly that sometimes it reached the point of absurdity. And besides, she heard that they said that the prince had lost the ability to feel any emotions after his entire family was killed. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he was acting like that. The prince sighed and said that Ludwig said that he would worry about him. She was surprised she didn't understand why he wanted to marry the princess at all. She said that the Anzac family didn't force him to choose her. He looked at her sideways and asked what she thought would happen to the princess when the war was over. She said that if the princess was useless here and could not maintain her position, she would definitely be killed. She knew that he could not start the whole wedding thing just to save her. She looked at the prince intently and wondered if he really wanted to save the princess he had just seen for the first time. She knew he would never do such a thing. She looked at the prince intently and asked if they had met before. The prince sighed heavily and said that it was true. She asked in surprise when it was Treason said that she had saved his life a long time ago. Treason sighed heavily and said that he didn't think she herself remembered it. Alexia froze in place in surprise, but moments later, she looked closely at the bouquet she wanted to give Callie. At the same time, the young knights blamed each other for what happened. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine and she would weave a new bouquet. The servant shouted and said that several hours had passed since she had done something like this. The knights were shocked since she had spent a lot of time on something like this, and they had ruined everything. They shouted that since they had ruined the old bouquet, they should find flowers for a new one. She said that they were not obliged to do this, but the knights did not back down and still helped the young lady. A moment later, one of the knights shouted that the break was over and they should all gather. Joseph looked at the princess and said that it was time for them to return as well. The knight looked closely at the princess and said with regret in his voice that they did not do it on purpose. He looked at the princess intently and said that they sincerely wanted to ask her forgiveness. After receiving the flowers, she said that everything was fine. They shouldn't worry about such things, and she also thanked them for their help. She looked closely at the flowers they had picked. Alexia knew she couldn't give them the bouquet anyway, but she still liked their apology. She heard some noise behind the door. The princess was surprised, because she did not understand who came to her at such a time. She told the visitor to wait a little while, and she would open the door right away. For a moment she froze as her inner voice told her that she was too trusting. She wondered if she didn't remember what happened to Reuben. Opening the door, she saw a knight in front of her. He once again asked for forgiveness for what happened that afternoon, and gave her a gorgeous bouquet of flowers. She looked at the bunk and the king with a smile on her face and told him that everything was fine. He didn't need to worry about such things. A moment later, she heard a noise. Looking out the door, she saw Joseph. She was a little surprised as she did not expect to see him so late in the evening. She looked at him intently and said that a knight had just come to see her and brought her a bouquet of flowers. He looked at the princess intently and said that he had come to her to give her a flower. She looked warily at the young man and asked who the flower was from. He said that it was a message from Anzakiah itself, and they said that it was very urgent. Edelweiss, her mother's name, which brings back memories of her hometown. She sighed heavily, for she knew that her mother was fading away day by day. She understood that they wanted to remind her to hurry and complete her task as quickly as possible. Joseph shouted to the princess that her father could not do such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really didn't know that the one he was so devoted to was a liar threatening his own daughter with her mother's life. He sighed heavily and said that this was very cruel. The princess looked at him with fury and said that he should believe that she could be more cruel. She told him to tell the prince that she would like to have tea with him. She was angry and said that she must complete her task. Alexia wondered if her mother would survive if she killed the prince. She thought that most likely she was just deluding herself with unrealistic dreams. She knew that he refused her offer. The princess in turn at first felt relieved, but now she felt uneasy. She sighed heavily and wondered what she really wanted. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door and gave her permission for the person to enter. She was surprised as no one entered. She looked at the window. She froze in surprise as she saw the prince. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that her choice of weapons for self-defense was incomparable. She looked at the prince with a sharp, angry look, but said nothing. The prince sighed heavily and said that she should have called the guards. The princess said that he would have gotten there faster through the window anyway. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had called her. He said that he had. She looked at him in surprise and asked why. The prince smiled and said that he would like to have tea with them. Alexia looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear something like that. He smiled and said that everything was exactly like that and asked if she was busy now. The young lady timidly said that she was busy with something. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was busy with. Alexia looked at him intently and said she needed to grind the herbs. He said she could put it off until tomorrow. The princess said she couldn't do that as they would wither, and he should look at it with me. The prince used his magic and told her to remove her hands. The young lady was surprised as he used his magic on her and on the box that contained the herbs. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that she could turn to him and more. He looked at the young lady with a satisfied and radiant smile and said that he would be with her. Now there was free time. She sighed heavily, agreed with him. Some time later, they sat quietly sipping tea on the terrace. She was wondering whether to poison him. While he was calmly sipping his tea, the princess looked at the prince and called him. He looked at her with a frown. He asked if she had added milk. The princess said she had not done so. A moment later, she said she was going to get some milk and asked if he wanted some more. He smiled and slowly handed her the cup. The princess was puzzled. She did not understand why he gave her his cup just like that. She knew that if she were in his place, she would never have done such a thing. The princess wondered if she should put poison in his tea now. She knew that she only had to complete her task. The princess understood that with Joseph's help she could return home. She really wanted the war to end, so that she would no longer have to sit and wait for death. She knew that when spring came, she could escape from the castle with her mother. She knew that the prince had killed many people, and she thought that, perhaps in the future, he would kill her and her mother. The young lady slowly handed the cup to the prince. The prince, in turn, slowly began to drink tea. He asked, surprised but calm, why she didn't pour herself another drink. The princess sighed heavily and said that she wouldn't be able to sleep at night if she drank any more. The prince sighed and said that, unfortunately, she couldn't lie at all. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at the princess with a sharp, angry look and asked why she had not given him poison. The princess was shocked. She did not expect to hear such a question. Taken aback, she asked how he found out. He looked at her intently and said that no matter how she pretended, it was written all over her forehead. He looked at her with fury and asked if she really had decided to kill him. He asked if that was the reason she suggested having tea. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. With lightning speed, he approached her and put a knife in her hands. The prince asked, why did she suddenly doubt, since she decided to do something like that? Pointing the knife at his heart, he showed her where it was. The prince looked at the young lady, intently said that one blow would be enough for her. The young lady in turn froze in shock. She felt sick and dizzy. The prince gently picked her up and called her. The young lady called for her mother in her thoughts, for she knew that if she killed the prince, they would sail away together. She knew that if she killed the prince, they would be together. Alexia threw the knife out of her hands, covering her face with her hands. She screamed that she couldn't do this. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if the king had ordered his death. She looked at him puzzled and asked if her answer would make any difference. He sighed heavily and said that she was right, that it would make no difference. He said that it seemed that she was determined to kill him. The prince slowly began to drink from the cup. The young lady screamed with rage. He looked at her in surprise, asked if she really wanted to drink it. Treason said that it was just ridiculous. The prince pulled the young lady closer to him. He hugged her tightly and said that even if she killed him, she should not die at all. He said that she should never even think about dying. In the end, the young lady was never able to kill the prince. She was unable to kill him, and this became her heavy burden. Hopelessness that made her forget that she was inside a book. Several days had passed since that incident, and she had stopped writing suicide notes. The prince had not accused her of anything, perhaps because he already knew what she would have answered. She thanked him and said goodbye. She thought that he could have abandoned the one who, due to her stupidity, could not complete the murder. She knew that her mother should not receive such letters even after her death. She sighed heavily, knowing that this would be best for everyone. Looking at the prince, she was at a loss as to what he was thinking. The princess did not turn away from him, even if one day he came to kill her. Unexpectedly for herself, at some point, she began to look only at him. She looked at the prince and asked if he would kill her. She hoped that he would still answer no, and if so, she knew what she had to do. The butler looked at the prince intently and called him. The prince looked at the man in surprise and asked if he had already returned. He asked Ludwig how the journey had gone. The man said that they were just lucky with the weather, so everything went smoothly, but he also hoped that his master was in good health. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was fine. The butler looked at the prince intently, for he knew that he was so indifferent to his own health that he was exhausting himself. He knew that the prince had never complained, but he still knew what he was going through. The prince looked at the butler intently and told him to look at him because he really was fine. Ludwig was surprised because the wound the prince had healed very quickly. The prince smiled and said that he had just had a very good rest. He said they could start with new medicines, and he also told the prince that his father had issued a new decree. The prince casually told the butler to get down to business. He said his father had forbidden the wedding, but had given permission for the agreement to be made. Ludwig said that he also expressed a desire to try honey from Lessingtelia. At the next festival, to celebrate the founding of the kingdom, the prince looked at him intently and told him to tell him that he did not mind. The prince looked at the man intently and told him to find him a priest before the beginning of autumn, without making any unnecessary noise. Ludwig asked the prince excitedly if this was all because of his condition. He was very excited, but the prince did not answer and silently looked at the man. A moment later, Ludwig asked the prince if he still intended to hold the wedding, even if it was secret from his father. The priest is in charge of the marriage. If the couple receives his blessing, then even the royal order will not be able to separate them, because this marriage union will be blessed with the goddess herself. The prince looked at the butler and said that if he had any better ideas, then he could speak right away. Ludwig asked the prince in surprise if he hadn't said that the princess would pretend to be his bride only until the end of the agreement. He said that he never said that he was going to make her queen until the end of the agreement. Ludwig looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he had brought the princess here then, if not because of the threat of war. The prince stood quietly and did not answer the question asked. The butler looked at the prince in surprise and said that it seemed that she was his beloved. He predicted that he did not care, and that he would keep her by his side. She thought for a moment, for of course she had sent Joseph to check everything, but she had not at all thought that the prince would not allow her to take the books out. She frowned for a moment as she saw a manual on magic. There are many who study magic, but only a few become magicians, because magic can only be mastered by those who have innate abilities. She thought that this was all very complicated. She knew that, for this reason, the prince was a kind of rare monster. She knew that she, too, was of royal lineage, and might also have something The young lady slowly reached for the book and the documents, but a moment later, the prince appeared behind her and said that she had made a slight mistake. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really interested in magic. The princess timidly said that she was a little interested in magic. She asked if this was really that magic. Turvian looked at her and said that she had already seen magic in the training hall. She looked intently at the prince, as he seemed to her even more magical than magic. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked why he had come to the library. As he was leaving, the prince said that she should follow him. The princess was a little puzzled, as she simply ran after him. She was surprised and wondered how he knew she was there. Alexia wondered if he had come to punish her. She was worried that something serious might have happened. She was afraid that he didn't like the fact that she had read books about magic. The young lady sighed heavily, for she did not at all think that she was forbidden to do so. She looked at him timidly and called out. The young lady looked at the prince intently and asked if something had happened. The prince looked at her sideways and said that they needed to prepare for the wedding ceremony. She stood there in surprise and asked in bewilderment what he was talking about. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he thought it would be limited to a banquet, but there was still a lot of preparation to be done. She asked if he had really come in person to tell her about something like this. Turvian said that was exactly it, and was told that she was in the library. He said that it was nice to watch the rain from there, and also asked if she liked being in such a place. She looked at him intently and said that it was her favorite place in the castle. Alexia asked if it mattered to him where she went, and Pri sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she didn't understand what he was talking about. The prince sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that she looked worse than she did then. He asked if she was eating well. She said that everything was as usual. The prince said that he would have to order that her portion be increased. She stood there in bewilderment, not understanding why he was even worried about her. She looked closely at the knights, as she knew that if she greeted them, they would be in trouble. The prince called the princess and told her to look at him. Turvian looked at Alexia intently and said that there was an Anzaki mole in the castle. He asked the young lady not to get close to anyone. He looked at her closely and asked if she understood him. The princess said that she would be careful. He said that in that case, they could hurry to another place. The prince also asked if she trusted Callie. The princess said that she trusted her, even though the girl hated her. Although she understood that the girl's irritation could not be called hatred, he looked closely at the princess and anxiously asked if he should assign someone else to her. She said she didn't need anyone else. The prince said anyone would agree to guard her if she asked. He asked if she was sure Callie was the one for her. She said that she didn't need anyone else. The prince agreed with her, and looking at the princess, he said that he would do as she wanted. Ludwig looked closely at the young people and greeted them. The young lady, in turn, knew that if the book was to be believed, then all those present were loyal servants of the prince, and they were ready to give their lives for him. The princess looked closely at the butler and introduced herself. Ludwig asked her forgiveness for not being able to greet her on the day of her arrival. She knew that the man was very devoted to the prince. The prince looked at everyone present and said that today he had gathered them all to discuss the wedding ceremony. The princess, in turn, looked at the prince in surprise. The man looked closely at the princess and said that since her skin was white and pure, they chose satin silk and lace as the material for the dress. He looked closely at the princess and asked what she thought about it. The princess, in turn, timidly said that she liked lace. He asked if they should make drapery. The princess thought for a moment. She was puzzled and did not understand what he was talking about. She timidly said that she could be added too. The man asked how long she wanted the hem. The young lady sheepishly said that she did not know. The man looked at her intently and said that long hemlines were in fashion now. But unfortunately, they were pressed for time, so a short one would do. He looked at her intently and asked what she thought about it. The princess was shocked, as she had never chosen an outfit, and she did not know what to do. She was scared. She said that they could make the outfit short. The man looked at her closely and said that she probably already knew, but he wanted to remind her that the hem was the bottom part of a dress. She said timidly and embarrassedly that in that case they could make it shorter. The prince approached the man and said something to him. The man looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The prince looked at him threateningly and said that he should not dare to smile anymore. The prince looked at the man with a sly smile, and he froze. A moment later, something very terrible happened. The princess froze in shock. The prince, in turn, looked at the man with fury and asked where he got so much courage. He asked the man who he thought he was laughing at. The young lady screamed in a way she had not expected. The man, trembling with fear, asked the prince for forgiveness and said that he was wrong. The prince looked at the man with fury and told him to shut his mouth immediately. The prince looked at the knights and told them to take him away quickly. The man was shocked and asked to give him another chance, and he would make the most beautiful outfit in the world for the princess. The prince looked at the man with fury and contempt and said that he had just missed his chance. The prince looked at the knights and told them to escort the man and make sure he was silent forever. A few minutes later, the prince slowly approached the princess and asked if she was scared. He sighed heavily and gently, wiping the blood from her face, said that if she stopped eating again, she would feel very bad. The princess looked at the prince with concern and asked if the man would really be hurt. The prince looked at his companion in surprise and asked if such a situation really bothered her. She sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that. The prince sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that she was a very unusual bride. She excitedly cried out that all this happened because of her ignorance. Therefore, she should receive the punishment. The prince looked at the princess intently and asked if she was really that soft. Whether it was because of her origin or because she became like that here, the princess did not answer. She was very puzzled because she knew that he was judging her. He called her a softie, but she was just worried about another person's life. She was confused and didn't know what was wrong with being soft. She was afraid of death, and without realizing it, she projected it onto other people. She just didn't want anyone to get hurt because of her. The prince looked at the princess intently and said that the beta no longer stood up for him for some pathetic servant. The young lady, in turn, froze in place. She could not utter a word, looking at the prince. A moment later, Ludwig entered their room. He said that a dispatch from Silfair had arrived. Treason was furious because he realized that the old fox was basically joking. He told his subordinate to tell everyone to gather in his office. As he left, he looked closely at the young lady and said that she should remain in her room. The young lady looked at the prince intently. She knew that he had done something wrong again. She knew that the war would soon begin. Anzakia must lose and later send Ophelia to Hadvenkia. She sighed heavily, and peace sank into her thoughts. She wondered what would happen to her after this happened. Alexia knew that there were only a few weeks left before her wedding. The man said angrily that the Ansaki people had sacked and looted several places on their border. The prince looked at the young man closely and asked how much damage there was. A moment later, the young man reported all the damage they had suffered. His friend was shocked. He didn't understand why they didn't react at all. He was furious and wondered if they were going to remain silent and tolerate this. The young man said the robbers were bigger than they thought, and their faces were covered, so they had no evidence or witnesses. The prince sighed heavily and said that they were most likely ordered to hide their connection with the kingdom. The young man sighed heavily and said that this was exactly the case, and they killed everyone indiscriminately, even children and women. The young people present were shocked. Since they had recently entered into an alliance, they were amazed that the king's daughter's life was worth nothing. Michael shouted furiously that in that case they must use the princess, and perhaps that would bring the old fox to his senses. The prince looked furiously at the young man and called him. The prince looked at everyone present and said that they should quickly understand the whole situation before they act. A moment later, he told everyone present what they needed to do. He said that they should not fall into the civilians' traps. Everyone listened carefully to the prince and agreed with him. Treason said that he would go to Duparma. They were surprised as they knew that it was the domain of Anzaki. They did not understand why he did this. The prince smiled and told them that the loss must be paid double. The knight looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he really wanted to resume the war. The boy said that he didn't want to do that. He only wanted to commit robbery. He knew that war was just a massacre based on envy and greed. The prince looked at everyone present with a smirk and said that the imperial brat should be treated accordingly. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly in the room thinking about this situation. She wondered if she would feel sorry if she begged for mercy. She knew that in her kingdom everything was done for Ophelia's sake. For this reason, she received absolutely nothing. She barely survived in conditions where she had no sympathy to expect from the maids assigned to her sick mother. She cried to the maid with tears in her eyes that her mother constantly refused to eat. She asked the maid to give her at least one piece of bread. She had no intention of changing that place, but she still wanted someone to help her. The maid looked at the girl with disdain and a smirk and threw her a piece of bread. The young lady knew that if she was looked down upon, she should behave accordingly. She looked closely at the bread that the maid threw to her. As trash, the young lady knew that she had no choice. She thanked the maid. She understood perfectly well that this was the only way to survive. The young lady sighed heavily and wondered if she should really try this time. She knew she should have held back when she was being made fun of. She was puzzled because she knew that if it had been Ophelia in her place, this would not have happened to her. Joseph knocked at the young lady's door and said he would show her into the room right away. She looked at him intently and said she would come out right away. As she left the room, she saw some young children counting, and the princess slowly walked up to them and told them the final number of their counts. The princess recoiled as she saw that the children were frightened. They greeted the princess with lightning speed. The girl said that she would clean everything up now, and also asked the princess for forgiveness. They asked the princess for forgiveness several times. The princess looked at the children closely and said with a smile that they did not need to worry as everything was fine. She looked at them intently and said that since the room was not ready yet, she could help them wash the floor. Joseph looked at the princess and said that she could go and he could manage on his own. The princess looked at him and with a soft smile said that she could help them a little and he didn't have to worry so much. The children hesitated, looking at the princess. They were surprised and did not know what to say to her. A moment later, they said that, while cleaning, she might get hurt, and then her blood would remain on the floor. The princess sighed heavily and looked at the children in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she timidly said that she understood everything, and Anila asked the princess for forgiveness. A moment later, the young lady began cleaning. The princess looked closely at the girl, as she had seen her somewhere before. Joseph said that it was all because the prince took her away from the war zone. The young lady looked at the princess intently and said that everything was ready. The boy accidentally slipped and fell. In doing so, he scattered all the documents that were in his hands. The young lady timidly apologized and asked her friend if he was okay. He looked at her closely and said that he was okay, but she needed to watch where she was going. The princess slowly picked up the boy's papers and noticed that there was a mistake. He looked at her in surprise as he did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at the boy intently and pointed out his mistakes. He was shocked. The young man, in a hurry, looking at the princess, told her the condition of the problem. She smiled and told him the correct answer. He looked at her in surprise and puzzledly said that in that case, all his answers were wrong. The princess looked at him with a smile and said that everything was fine. He didn't need to be upset. She asked if he wanted her to help him. He said that everything was fine and they would figure it out themselves. Anila asked her friend in surprise what he was talking about. She was sure that they were finished by now. He said that he didn't think so. The princess smiled and said that he did not need to worry, as she and Joseph would not tell anyone about this. The young lady looked at the princess with a smile and said that this was simply incredible. The young man also thanked the princess. They looked closely at the princess and asked where she studied mathematics. Alexia smiled and said that she had been studying it for a long time, and it was not very difficult. A moment later, she said that it was time for her to go. The girl looked at the princess with a smile and said that she had taken the apple while she was picking up fruit that had fallen from the tree due to the rain. She handed the princess the apple and said that she would like to share it with her. She looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that she did not need to worry, as he was fine. The young man stopped his friend and asked the princess for forgiveness. He said that the girl was still young and ignorant. The princess smiled and said that everything was fine. She thanked the young lady and also said that she would eat it a little later. Joseph looked at the princess intently and said that she should not eat the apple. The princess was surprised and looked at him as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he said more insistently that she could not eat such things. She froze in surprise. He told the princess that she could not trust everyone. She looked at her servant in surprise and said that the girl was just a child. He said that she still couldn't do that. The princess said that when she was 6, she already knew how to wield a sword. He looked at her intently and said, "There are people here who want her dead." He said she can't trust them. The princess froze in place, as she knew everything perfectly well. She looked at her friend closely and asked if the girl was from Halvenkia. He said that she was not. But he still looked at the princess and said that she must be careful. She froze for a moment because she knew that she could not trust anyone. He looked at the princess and said that she was a person from the kingdom of Anzac. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She was shocked, wondering if just sending her to such a place was not enough. She screamed in rage, did she really have to die? And only then would he be satisfied. She screamed and asked, is it all because she is not Ophelia, or because she cannot kill the prince? The servant came closer to her and called her. The princess was hysterical. She knew that now she was here just as he wanted. She was furious, wondering if he really wanted her to die here now. She looked at the young man with fury and asked if he really wanted her to die too. Joseph screamed that it was not so. Trembling with fear, she said that she did not want to die at all. She said that she really wanted to live. The princess was furious, and at the same time shocked as she understood perfectly well that all the people wanted to kill her. Joseph looked at the princess intently and said that it was time for her walk. The princess was puzzled. She didn't want anything at all. She looked intently at the young man and said that she did not want to go anywhere. Looking at the princess, the butler told all the smallest details about their wedding ceremony. The princess sighed heavily, as she knew that most likely even Ludwig wanted her dead. He looked at the princess intently and asked if she was listening to him. The princess sighed heavily and, coming to her senses, said that she was listening to him. A moment later, he continued his story. Joseph looked at the princess and said that there would be no one in the flower garden tomorrow, so she could go and walk there whenever she wanted. She sighed heavily and casually said that she would be in her room. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't trust him. The princess looked at the young man intently and said that if she didn't trust anyone, she would be afraid to breathe. Alexia looked at the young man intently and said that she trusted only him. He froze in place in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he said that it was time for him to go. He left her and she was left alone. She knew that on the day her mother gave birth to her, she was all alone in a small room. Then she was born in the midst of chaos. She was puzzled by the fact that no one even knew when exactly she was born. Thinking about it, now she realizes that she never celebrated her birthday. She sighed heavily as she understood the reality very well. She knew that she was destined to die eventually. There was a knock at the young lady's door. She thought it was her servant Joseph, and so she said he could come in. Without looking up at the man who entered, she told Joseph that he must take a bandage with him next time when he comes. The prince looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she was hurt. The princess was taken aback, as she did not expect to see the prince in front of her. The prince looked intently at her lady. She asked in surprise why he was there. The princess timidly said that he had told her earlier that he was too busy. He said that he was. He looked closely at the princess, and coming closer to her, said that her edge was again doing whatever it wanted. She sighed heavily, as she understood perfectly well that he did not think about such trifles as she did. The prince looked at her intently and asked why she needed a bandage. He was worried that she could get hurt somewhere. She looked away from him and sighed heavily and said that she was fine. The prince was worried what was the problem. Then Alexia sighed heavily and said that Anzac would not rest until he captured Halvenkia. She knew that he would do anything to take over the whole world. The prince looked at her closely and said, "It seems she is waiting for this moment." He asked if, after the victory, she really wants to run away. She froze in place for a moment in surprise and thought, but a moment later, she sighed heavily and said that she would not go back there. The prince came closer to the princess with lightning speed. She froze in place in surprise because she was a little afraid of him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was trying to achieve with her behavior. He said that she would not have behaved like that if he had not deprived the head of that one into a moron. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. The prince sighed heavily and told her that the tailor was still alive, so she could stop behaving like that. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he meant by that. He asked why she no longer went outside and walked around the castle. The princess hesitated. She didn't know what to answer to the question asked. He asked if she had really had a fight with someone about us. The prince came even closer to her and said that he was sure that he had already told them how to behave with her, but it seemed that it would be necessary to repeat it again. He looked at her closely and asked if she cared, who in the castle hated her and who did not. The prince gently touched her face and said that he didn't think he could help her with that. Even if he was always by her side, they would still hate her, because she was Anzac. The young lady was taken aback. She said that was not true. He looked at her intently and asked if that was not the case. Then how was it then? She reached for his hand and said that she needed a bandage to do something. She looked at him intently and, unwrapping her hand, said that if nothing was done about it, it would only get bigger sooner. She sighed heavily and said that she did not go outside because it was cold now, and she thought that many people would not like it if she walked around the castle without a reason. He looked at her intently and asked if it was because she was afraid of him. Alexia said that of course it was not so. Nothing frightened her more than her homeland. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that if this was so, then she could stay with him and no one would ever dare to kill her. The princess froze in surprise. She did not know what to answer. She was puzzled because she knew that her feelings for the prince were growing right in her heart, and this was very dangerous. She understood perfectly well that she should not react in this way. She knew that the prince belonged entirely to Ophelia. If he met her, he would fall head over heels in love with her. She was in shock because she knew he would destroy everything, even himself. She didn't want to fall in love with him at all. She didn't want to believe him and trust him. She knew that in the end, her life meant nothing to him. She looked at the prince intently and asked if he really meant to say that even if a war broke out, he would not kill her. The prince sighed heavily and asked irritably, what was the point of killing his wife? He looked at her intently and asked if she really thought he would kill her. She sighed heavily and timidly said that if a war started, he would not need her since she would become useless. Treason sighed heavily since he understood why everything went wrong. He looked at her with fury and asked if she really thought that he would kill her if something went wrong according to his plan. Without looking at the prince, she said that he himself said that she was worth nothing. The prince grabbed her hand in anger and asked if she was worthless. He said that if her kingdom broke their agreement, then she could go away in peace. He asked in anger if she now understood her worth. He asked if she really thought he had anything more precious than his bride. She looked at the prince in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. But a moment later, she said that it hurt a little, and the prince slowly let go of her hand. Treason sighed heavily and said that he now understood what she thought of him. He said that he needed to leave the castle for a while, and when he returned, she must be ready in order to prove her worth as his wife. He said that otherwise, as she had said, he would throw her out. She looked at him in surprise and asked where he was going. The princess looked at the prince in surprise and asked if some war had really started again. He sighed heavily and said that nothing had started yet, and he just needed to go to Dynarma for a short while. The prince left, and the princess in turn was left alone with her thoughts. With tears in her eyes, she begged him, because she didn't want him to go that far. The man looked at the prince intently and called out to him as he rode on his horse. The prince was taken aback, and quickly grabbed the reins, stopping the horse. The prince looked at the sphere with anger. He was very angry because he saw all the spies. From the kingdom, he asked the man if there were any traces. The man sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he had never seen anything like it. The prince gave him the sphere and told him to return it to its place. Ludwig told the prince that he was very worried about him. The prince looked at the man with fury and said that they would have found out about the attack sooner or later anyway, and even if they had found out, he certainly would not have died there. Ludwig looked at the prince intently and asked him not to overexert himself there, predicting that he was trying to keep in mind the thought that the princess was familiar with all of them. The man looked at the prince intently and said that he did not know for sure. The prince looked at the knight and said that he must stay to guard the princess. The young man was in shock. He shouted that the princess already had security. He asked the prince to take him with him. Turvion looked menacingly at the knight and said that he would not change his mind, so he waited for his move. The knight sighed heavily and said that he would take care of the princess. Turvion said that he should not take his eyes off her. He agreed. The prince coldly told the knight not to allow anyone to even touch the princess with a finger. The knight was furious. He shouted that now he felt like a dog locked in a cage. He did not understand what was happening at all. The princess looked at Ludwig worriedly and asked what the knight was doing here. Ludwig smiled and said that it seemed that the prince ordered him to guard her. She sighed heavily as Ludwig spoke, as if the knight was only here because of her. Ludwig looked at the princess and said that he thought it was time for them to call it a day. He asked if she wanted to rest a little. The princess smiled and said that was a very good suggestion. She told the man that he should have a good rest. He looked at the princess with a smile on her face and said that he appreciated her concern. A moment later, the princess froze in place. The knight looked at the princess in surprise and called her. He said that the prince told him that she needed a bandage. He looked at the princess in surprise and said that he did not see any wounds on her body. She looked at him in surprise and said that of course she was not hurt, but still she always carried it with her just in case. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was looking at her so intently. The young lady looked at the knight intently and asked why he was protecting her. He came closer to her and said that it was all because he was ordered to do it. She sighed heavily as she now understood perfectly well what was really happening. The knight looked at her and said that if she wanted something, they should do everything to please her. And even if she was the princess of an enemy country, he said that they would like to become her friends since they would soon become family. And it seemed that she wanted the same thing. Alexia looked into the distance. She understood that they didn't care that she was the princess of an enemy country. The young lady looked into the distance. She was very happy because she saw that carriages with provisions were arriving for them. Ludwig smiled and said that it seemed that an express delivery from the capital had arrived even faster than expected. The young lady shouted that she would call the servants right away. Ludwig looked at the princess intently and asked if she wanted to take a look too. She looked at him intently, with a smile on her face, but a moment later she was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the princess said with a smile that she would go and have a look. They were slowly descending the stairs when suddenly a servant called Ludwig. He smiled and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The young man smiled and said that they were expecting them later, but it seemed that they were lucky with the weather. He asked where the prince was going, as he needed to say hello to him. Ludwig said that the prince was about to leave. He said that they were probably tired from the long journey. Ludwig smiled and said that they would probably go straight to bed. The young man smiled and said that the accounting had been going well lately, and there were almost no mistakes. Ludwig looked at the young man with a smile. A moment later, the young man turned his gaze to the princess and was taken aback. Ludwig smiled and said that it was the princess. The young man was puzzled. He realized that she was the one from the rumors. He asked him to forgive him and left them in anger. The young lady looked at the princess intently and asked her to look at something. She said with a beaming smile that the flowers for the ceremony had arrived. The young lady ran like lightning towards the beautiful flowers. She was surprised because they were simply shining. The princess in turn thought for a moment that she would soon have to walk down the aisle. She sighed heavily and wondered if she would really marry the prince. A moment later, she heard the men talking. They said that the daughter of the sly fox had come to them. And it turned out to be true. They knew that she was sent here to them to confirm the alliance. They said that this peace treaty was just nonsense, since a few days ago the kingdom had destroyed their villages on the border. They wanted to know what their princess was like. The young man mockingly said that she was just cannon fodder. The princess froze in shock. She sighed heavily as she realized she had been presumptuous. She wasn't even sure if she could enjoy these flowers. Joseph looked at the princess intently and said that it was time for them to return. She agreed with him. The young men were surprised that the prince did not kill the princess. They said that she certainly did not survive thanks to her seductive powers. The man said that judging by her appearance at night, she was not averse to having fun. Joseph rushed towards them in rage. The princess stopped him and asked him to calm down. but he in turn shouted at them to shut their mouths if they did not want to be punished. The princess froze in place in surprise when she saw the knight. The man was shocked and did not understand why and for what he was now receiving from the knight. Gaster looked at the young man with fury and shouted for him to shut up. He asked him if he was not currently training. He looked closely at the young man and asked him if he knew why their knights were called red wolves. Trembling with fear, the man said that he didn't know. Gaster angrily pushed the man away, and he fell to the ground with a crash. The knight looked at the young man with fury and said that it was because their uniforms were not drying from the blood. He said that if he said anything like that again about the future mistress of the castle, he would make a scabbard for his sword out of his mouth. He looked at the man closely and asked if he understood. The knight looked sideways at the princess and said that they should go already as they still had a lot to do. The princess thanked her knight with a smile for his protection. She heard someone say that she was the future hostess. She froze in place for a moment. Everyone present was shocked and wondered if they were really going to have a wedding. They knew that the prince had received a letter from the emperor. The man ran with the speed of lightning, as the castle was ablaze. As he ran, he heard cries of supplication. He quickly ran around the corner and saw that there were too many people chasing him. The prince's squad of mages exterminated the entire elite army at once, and he personally finished off the rest with his sword. The prince burst into the castle with fury. He looked sideways at everyone present. He looked at them with fury and counted the number of people with lightning speed. The knight looked at the prince intently and said that he would clear the way. The prince said that they needed to hold the line. The knight looked at the prince in surprise and asked if it wasn't all over already. The prince attacked the knights with lightning speed. He shouted that everything would end only when they returned back to the castle. The knight shouted to his friend to hold the line, but he grinned and said that he was running to the rescue. The young men were surprised because they had underestimated the enemy's defense. The prince, with the speed of lightning, looked at everyone present and shouted that they needed to retreat. The young man looked at them with a joyful grin as he wanted them all to die. Some time later, the prince froze in place in surprise. As he was blinded by the spell, a roar was heard in the castle. The knight looked closely at the prince and asked if he was hurt anywhere. The prince dismissively told his friend to take care of himself, and he would take care of the rest himself. The prince looked at everyone present and said that there was an informant. They looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about and who exactly this informant was. Treason said that he had his connections everywhere. A moment later, they received a letter. The knight said that this letter from the castle reported that Prince Chevalion was heading to the castle. The prince was surprised because his brother was heading to the castle. He knew that he really wanted to kill him. He was worried that his bride would be left alone with his brother. The prince was furious because he knew that he would pay back his family for everything. The knight looked at everyone and asked excitedly where Eel was. His friend sighed heavily and said that he was dead. He was puzzled since he had told him to keep in line. The knight thought for a moment, as he knew that this was just nonsense, because before the magic circle was activated, he jumped back into the corner. He said that he used one of the soldiers as a shield, and when they retreated, he walked right behind him. The knight looked at his friend and asked if he was sure. He sighed heavily and said that, of course, he was sure. A moment later, the knight struck the young man with lightning speed and said that he was very sorry. The young lady smiled and asked her subordinate if they had killed them. He looked at the young lady closely and said that they were still waiting for confirmation. She said with a satisfied smile that it was absolutely necessary to kill him. He said that in Halvenkia there are their people, and this time they will have another chance, even if they make a mistake. She said with a smirk that this will not happen. The lady knew that today the prince must certainly be deprived of life. The young man looked at her intently and said that that magic circle was created by the 5 royal magicians, and it was very difficult for even a strong magician to escape from it. He looked at her intently and said that she didn't need to worry. Ophelia looked at the young man with a smile. The young lady walked to the window with a smile, as the room was very boring. She slowly opened the scroll and began to read. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand why she could not do anything. Anila looked at her friend intently and asked why the princess was not allowed to go outside. She knew that the princess would soon become the mistress of the castle. He looked at her intently and said that she should choose her expression. Since he did not understand what kind of mistress of the castle she was, she said that she was the prince's bride, and therefore the mistress of the castle. The young man looked at her intently and said that no one believed it. The engagement was fictitious, and Prince O had gone to sort things out with the kingdom before the wedding. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked what was wrong with the princess. He said he didn't know and asked her if she really wanted to trust the princess. She screamed that she had no intention of trusting anyone. She just wanted to be treated as a prince's bride should be treated. The young man angrily told her not to get close to the princess. Anila looked at her friend closely and said that the princess had helped him recently. He held side and said that it was so. She looked at him intently and said that they didn't know for sure if she was a bad person. The princess watched them closely for some time, and they were arguing all the time. She looked at them with a satisfied smile, but a moment later she realized that it was time for her to go back. The young people were walking slowly. They heard that the princess was now in her room. They were for the sake of that abomination, not to come across their eyes. The young man said that he thought that he would die from this fish stench. She sighed. She wondered what they were even talking about. She knew it was better than getting scolded by the prince. The young lady, with Milan's fury in front of them and dust flying into their eyes, they were furious and screaming for her to stop. He grabbed her clothes in anger because she did not listen to him. He shouted that she was a simple ragamuffin. The princess was shocked. She looked at them with fury and said that they were being too noisy. She looked at the young people with contempt and anger and said that it seemed to be customary here to mock children. She said that they had no shame or conscience. The young man looked at the princess with fury and sideways glance, and a moment later released the girl. She fell to the ground with a crash. Alexia looked at the young man closely and told him to apologize. The man apologized for the noise and disturbance. The princess looked at the young man with fury and said that he should apologize not to her, but to the girl. The young man in turn sighed heavily, but did not answer. He was furious that he was being forced to apologize. Alexei looked at him intently and said with fury that it seemed like he knew how to make fun of the weak, but didn't know how to apologize. The man screamed that everyone thought it was just pointless. He cursed with fury and anger and casually asked for an apology. The princess looked at him with fury and told him to say it again. The man was taken aback as he felt the aura of the princess. But a moment later, he asked for forgiveness, and with the speed of lightning left their company. The princess sighed heavily because she knew that everything was already over. The young lady quietly knocked on the princess's room door and called her. She slowly walked into the princess's room and asked if she hated her because she was from Halvankia. The princess looked at the girl intently and said that if she hated her, she would not have helped her. The young lady froze in surprise. She didn't expect to hear something like that at all. A moment later, she handed her an apple and said that she had just picked it. Joseph looked at the princess and called her, since he did not want her to eat anything like that. The princess accepted the fruit, but Joseph insisted that she not eat it. The princess slowly took a bite of the apple. With lightning speed, her mouth was filled with sweet taste. She knew that nothing terrible happened after that. She looked closely at the young lady and thanked her with a smile. The princess smiled, as she knew it would be good if she could only eat that. A few days later, the knight watched the princess closely. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had any messages for her. He hesitated, not knowing how to answer her question. Looking away, he said it was about food. He asked if she wanted to have lunch at a restaurant. The knight said that the people had returned from the capital and brought supplies the cook had tried very hard, and if she wanted, she could have a tasty dinner. Alexia looked closely at the knight and asked if it would be okay if she ate. He smiled and asked what could go wrong. The knight said that they could go now. The young lady agreed with the knight with a radiant smile. Gaster looked at the princess intently and asked why she didn't come in. He didn't understand what she was doing at all. The princess accidentally stumbled and fell right at the entrance. She looked intently at all the knights who were sitting and eating. They looked at her with bewilderment. The princess was puzzled and scared by the pressure of all the looks. Joseph looked intently at everyone present and said that the princess had come. She said that he could sit somewhere else. The knight looked at the princess in surprise and asked why she should do that. She looked at him timidly and said that this was his place. The knight sat the princess down with lightning speed. He said that she could sit anywhere since she was the mistress. He sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. He looked at everyone present with fury. He said that it must be, and not the first time they meet her. He said that this is the princess, the prince's bride, and at the moment she is pregnant. He said that at the moment they must treat her with respect. He said that they should not say anything about the past and should look at her with respect. He asked if they understood him. All those present said that they understood him. A moment later, they continued their meal. He looked at the princess with a smile and wished her bon appetit. She smiled back at her knight, as she was glad that he had protected her. A moment later, the chef approached them and greeted the princess. He introduced himself with a smile and said that he had been told that the steak was not to her taste. Joseph quietly told the princess everything, and she dried him with bewilderment. She remembered that dish. She looked at the cook closely and asked for forgiveness, as she could not stand raw food. He smiled and said that, in that case, she could try something else. The princess looked at him in surprise, as she did not know what to do. The cook smiled and said that he was asking her to do it. A moment later, she finally agreed and began to eat. The princess smiled and said that the dish was really very tasty. The knight looked at the princess intently and called her. He said that she should try again. The princess looked at him in bewilderment, but still a moment later, she was enjoying a wonderful meal. Gaster looked at the princess with a beaming smile. A moment later, he said that she was very nice. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he had just said. He stroked her head tenderly and said that she should eat a lot because now she looked very weak. The princess froze in place in surprise, but did not answer. She looked closely at everyone present and with a radiant smile agreed with him. A moment later, a knight burst in and shouted that he had urgent information for everyone present, as light was visible in the forest. The knight looked at everyone present and told Joseph to take the princess to my room, and the rest should follow him. The princess was surprised and, without any problem, looked at those present and asked the cook what had happened. The cook said that he thought nothing terrible had happened, but still she should just rest. A moment later, they were informed that Mr. Jubilian Wu was already in the castle. Everyone looked at the knight with surprise and caution. Young Lydia froze in surprise, for she knew that the prince's brother had come to them. He was also his only enemy. The man who occupied the throne was only stopped by Treason, and he was the man who hated his brother with all his heart. The cook looked closely at his assistant and asked how close he had managed to get. The young man said that he was just passing through the castle gates. The cook looked sideways at the princess and said that the beta had gone into the prince's room and tried to take the best fur coat, with only the best fur. She looked at him in bewilderment. He also shouted for someone to bring her the ring. He looked closely at the princess and called her. The princess looked at the cook in bewilderment. She was puzzled and did not understand what was happening. A moment later, he put a ring on her finger. She was surprised and did not understand what was happening and why he gave her the ring. She wondered if they were doing everything to dress her up and later give her to the first prince. The young man shouted angrily and called the princess as he saw that she had frozen in place. He looked at her hard and said that they would have to use the reserve sooner than they thought. He asked if she understood what he was talking about now. Alexia froze in place. She didn't know what to answer. A moment later, she said that she understood everything. He exhaled heavily and said that he believed that she could handle it. Everyone looked closely at the princess and said that she should take care of herself. She knew perfectly well that most likely only Ophelia could hold him back. The princess looked at everyone present and said that she would do it. A moment later, the princess and her servants greeted the prince. As he descended from his horse, the prince sighed heavily and said that they could calm down. He looked at everyone present and said with a smile that he hoped they too would be the light of the empire. The prince looked at everyone present in surprise and asked why he didn't see his handsome brother among them. Gaster said that the prince had said that he would arrive later. The prince sighed heavily and said with a grin that he had not paid any attention to it at all. He slowly walked up to the princess and said with a grin that she seemed to be the girl from those spread rumors. He looked at her with a grin and touched her face. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said threateningly that she was very glad to see him. A moment later, she introduced herself and said that her name was Alexia Harbakia. The prince looked at the princess with fury. He did not understand why she behaved in this way. The knight quickly approached the princess and, respectfully kissing her hand, said that he had returned with his mission. The princess said that she was very glad that he had returned. The prince looked at the princess in surprise and said that he did not think that his brother would give her his last name and did not understand why she introduced herself. She looked at him intently and asked in surprise what was wrong with using her husband's last name. The young man looked at her with a grin. The princess smiled and said that she would soon officially become his wife. He looked at the princess with fury and said that she was just trash from a foreign country. He did not like it when dogs like her barked and acted arrogantly. He looked at her intently and asked if she thought she should not act like that. He said that most likely she could be a spy. The princess looked at the prince intently and said that she had only been sent to keep the peace. He asked her if she knew that the marriage had not been approved by the emperor. She asked if it was because she came from a country where he was waging war. She said that it seemed to him that her death was more advantageous. The prince looked at her with a grin and said that this was not so. He said that His Majesty simply did not approve of this wedding. Therefore, her rights were no more than those of a concubine. The princess looked at the prince with concern and asked how he was feeling as his complexion was unhealthy. The prince shouted angrily and told her to leave him alone. He shouted that she should mind her own business. He shouted that his brother should be standing in front of him now. The princess looked at the prince intently and said that even though she had not received the king's approval, she was still a princess. The prince looked at her with a grin and asked what this meant. He said that war was just around the corner and asked if she really thought that she would stay alive thanks to the agreement. She looked at the prince intently and said that when the war starts, then they will talk about it for a while. There was silence between them. They did not say anything to each other. They only looked intently. She looked at the prince intently and wondered what it would be like if her future husband knew about it. She knew that when he met Ophelia, he would do everything for her. It was only a matter of time. She knew that, unfortunately, she would not be able to leave quietly. She wondered if she should continue to maintain a positive attitude despite her approaching demise. He looked at her with fury and said that the younger ones often behaved quite insolently towards the older ones. He said that since she was so clinging to this agreement, he might as well give her a chance to fulfill it. The princess froze in surprise as he tugged and touched her. He looked at the princess intently and asked her how about coming to his room today and sleeping with him. Mockingly, he said that it didn't matter to her who she spread her legs for, and by the way, he was also a prince, so the agreement wouldn't be broken. The princess looked at him with cold fury. He asked her with a smirk why she was so hesitant. He said that she could sleep with him. The knight looked at the prince and asked him to stop since she was already engaged. The prince shouted at the knight to leave him alone, since anyone who contradicted him would be killed. The prince looked at everyone present with a grin. In turn, Gaster stood in their way. He looked at the prince with cold fury. The prince was puzzled and furious, because he did not understand how he dared to contradict him. The princess shouted at her knight to stop and leave quickly. She screamed at the prince to calm down, but the prince, with the speed of lightning, pulled out his knife and began to threaten the knights. The lady looked closely at the prince and asked what he was doing in someone else's lands. He looked at the princess with a smirk and asked if she didn't want to spread her legs for him. Then how was she going to save herself? She said that she wasn't going to do anything like that even if she died tomorrow. The princess said that she had come as a guest to the Germans, so they should take responsibility for her life. She said that he would have to treat her with respect and allow her to exist normally. He asked with a grin if she really thought that, since she was a princess, she could command him. He said that she had not taken into account one point. The prince said that the result of the agreement, when it was signed, could be cancelled at any moment. He asked if she was aware of this. She looked at the prince intently, without taking her eyes off him, and said that she was aware of this, but she also said that she was not going to go back on her words. He looked at her sharply and said that she was being very brave in hoping to take the place of the crown princess. She looked at him sharply and said that he could think as he wanted. She was not going to report to him. He sighed heavily and said that she was a very unusual girl who was not afraid of the emperor's wrath and went against the prince's will with all her heart. He said that it seemed like his brother was suffering under her thumb. The princess said that it would be very sad if he lost his authority in the eyes of the emperor, but that was none of her business. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was his direct flaw, and he thought that if his brother were not there, he would be much better off. She looked at the prince and said that she did not need their family squabbles, and it was important to her that he remember that she was not a toy, but a princess with an important status. The prince looked at the princess and laughed at her words. He smiled and said, "Princess, that he just realized that it seems that his brother chose her for more than just the treaty." He looked closely at the princess and said that most likely his brother wanted the lands of her kingdom. The prince said that he would not give his brother a single piece of the earth and let him not even dream about it. The prince, with a satisfied grin, said that he would not give him anything and would even take the throne from him. The princess quietly told the prince that he was rejoicing too soon. She said that he should remember that the war was still not over. The prince stopped in his tracks after her words, and with lightning speed, he grabbed her shoulder in fury. He was furious and did not understand how she dared to say something like that to him. He screamed and coughed. He said that he would never lose. He screamed that he would not let him take the throne. A moment later, he threw the young lady aside and stepped back from her. She looked at the prince with concern and asked if he was all right. The knight ran up to the prince and asked if he was okay. The prince waved them away angrily and told them not to come near him. The princess looked intently at everyone present and firmly said that they should stand still and under no circumstances approach him. But in turn, she slowly approached him. The prince shouted in rage that she should not approach him, as he would kill her. She looked closely at the prince and told him to calm down, not to panic, and to breathe deeply. The prince shouted at her to move away, as he did not need her help at all. She slowly covered his mouth, and looking into his eyes told him that he should slowly inhale and exhale. He froze in shock. She looked at him intently and said that it was very good that he understood her, because he was already feeling much better. A moment later, when the prince felt better, he pushed her away. Alexia looked closely after the prince, as all the servants surrounded him and asked if he was okay. He said that he was very tired and wanted to go to his room. As he left, the prince glanced sideways at the princess. Joseph quickly ran to the princess. He was glad that she was not hurt. He said that they should return quickly. The princess thanked Joseph. The knight looked at the princess intently and said that they needed to leave quickly. The princess looked at her knight and thanked him with smiles. He said that he was just doing what he had to do. She was surprised and puzzled, as it was really difficult to understand such a thing. She lay quietly in her bed for a while. She looked at the knight intently and asked if her future wife had already returned to her room. The knight looked at her intently and said that he did not know that, but still she did not need to worry about such things, and she should rest for a while. He looked closely at the princess and said that the knights would guard her in the morning, and so she could go to bed and have a good night's sleep. She woke up and heard someone's voice, but she decided to get some sleep. Alexia was in shock and didn't know how long she would have to endure this. She wondered how long she could hold out. She hugged her future husband's fur coat tightly. She missed him very much. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked if this was a dream. The prince looked intently at the princess and said that everything was exactly like that and it was a dream. She looked at him in surprise and said that she could smell herbs. The princess told the prince that it seemed like the smell was coming from him. Treason sighed heavily and said that he just ran through the forest like a madman. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he did something like that. He said that it was all because his brother came to their castle. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really going to see the prince. He smiled and asked if she was really against it. The prince smiled and said that he was very interested in whether she liked his brother. She hesitated, but a moment later said that he seemed to her like a bad person. The prince looked at the princess with anger and said that he heard that she had had a hard day because of him. She looked at him in surprise and casually asked if he really knew about everything. The prince said that everything was exactly like that. The princess looked closely at the young man and said that he looked even more handsome when he smiled. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that it didn't matter, but at the same time, she gently stroked his face. She smiled and said it was very good that he was back. The prince said that he already knew that she was waiting for him very much. She smiled and said that everything was true. The princess said with a satisfied smile that she knew he would certainly protect her. Some time later, the princess woke up from a long sleep. She sighed heavily because she thought it was a dream. She doubted that the prince would kill her, but she knew that she had to keep her ears open. The princess sighed heavily because she thought that she was very hot going out onto the balcony. The princess heard Joseph calling her. He was surprised that she woke up. He looked at her intently and said that it was time to eat. He shouted that they were immediately under the room. The princess looked intently at the young man but did not answer. She sighed heavily and told herself that she was already awake. She told herself that she needed to stop thinking about him already. The princess came out into the hall and called her husband, but a moment later she was taken aback. The prince glanced sideways at the young lady in bewilderment. The princess looked at the prince intently and greeted him. She realized that, unfortunately, it was not her husband in front of her. He looked casually at the princess and greeted her. Alexia looked closely at the prince and asked how he slept all night. He grinned. He looked at the young lady and said that he didn't feel very good, since the room was cramped and it wasn't really cleaned. He asked with a grin why there was such a loud noise at dawn, since he couldn't really sleep to such an extent that it was disgusting, and he didn't even wonder if it was done on purpose. The butler looked at the prince and asked him to stop, as he had been given the best guest room. The prince was shocked and did not understand how they dared to contradict him. He said that it was terrible. Ludwig asked the prince for forgiveness. The prince looked at the butler and asked if he had really lit so much wood on purpose to burn him. The butler looked at the prince in surprise, but still said that he just wanted the prince to be warm at night. The principal looked closely at the princess and asked when his brother would return. Ludwig looked at the prince and said that he had received a message that he would arrive in a few days. The princess thought for a moment that her future husband would return in a few days. The prince looked at the princess with a haughty grin and said that it seemed that she missed his brother very much. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He came to me later and said that everything was exactly like that, and she misses him very much. The prince angrily told her to put away the food too. He looked at her intently and said that he was not able to eat this slop. The cook looked closely at the princess and asked if she had called him. She smiled at the man and said that she had already eaten, and it was very tasty. The prince looked at the princess with surprise and contempt and asked, "Does she really want to say that this food that tasted like slop is delicious?" The princess looked at the prince but did not answer him. He said with a grin that he was told that her mother was of low birth. Like a commoner, Ludwig looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he was saying this. The prince, with an arrogant grin, told the princess that even if she would be considered a concubine, it doesn't offend her at all because she has disgustingly dirty blood. Ludwig looked at the prince intently and asked him to stop disrespecting the princess, but the prince looked at the butler with fury and told him to shut his mouth because it was too noisy. The prince shouted furiously at the butler. For some time, he shouted to those present to seize the ill-mannered servant and punish him properly. The princess sat quietly and listened to all the shouting, but she was furious. She knew that her honor was very easy to defame because it never existed. She looked at the prince with fury and said that all his words were true. He looked at the princess with a smile because he did not expect to hear something like that. She looked at him intently and said that he had indeed spoken the truth. After all, her mother was indeed of low birth, so his words were not at all inappropriate. She said that she knew how she could make up for the inconvenience that her servant had caused. She asked him to accept her deepest apologies. The prince looked at the young woman with a haughty grin and said that she seemed to be truly ashamed of the servant's actions. Alexia said that this was exactly the case, because it was not something that was hidden from the eyes of people. The prince asked if her father had decided to abandon her here. She said that he had decided to send her as proof of peace. The prince looked at the princess with a smile and asked if this was true. A moment later, he showed his generosity and ordered his knights to release the butler. The princess told the butler that she needed someone who could give her a tour of the castle. The butler, breathing heavily, looked at the prince and said that he himself could accompany him. The prince looked at the princess with a grin and told the butler that he did not have to do this because the mistress of this place could accompany him. He smiled, looking at the princess, and asked if he was speaking correctly. She did not answer. The princess looked closely at the prince and said that she would like to ask if he was feeling better. The prince asked her angrily how she dared to call him sick. She sighed heavily and said that anger is bad for your health. He looked after her with bewilderment and asked why she was worried about him. It would be better if she took care of herself. The princess sighed heavily and said that she was not at all sad about this because her father had truly abandoned her in the distant past. He was surprised and looked at her and asked if she was really okay. He asked if she was okay after her father threw her out several times. The princess said that she was okay and was quite happy with the way things were. He said that yesterday he mentioned that he wanted her to sleep with him. She looked at the prince intently and said that he could not go against the law. He looked at her with a grin and asked if it were not for the law, whether she would agree. The princess said that she did not agree, because as he had already said, her blood was half dirty. She asked, is he really ready to marry her and make her, even if his child is not considered ideal? The prince said that everything is correct, and it is not so difficult since his child simply has to be ideal. She looked at the prince in surprise, because she saw that he felt bad again. The prince was in shock. He understood what was happening and called his mother. She saw that the prince had moved away from her. Alexia looked closely at the prince and said that he needed to catch his breath. The prince was furious, but at the same time he felt very bad. The princess came closer to him and said that he should breathe more slowly. He shouted that she should move away from him, but the princess did not even intend to do so. She covered his mouth with lightning speed and calmly told him to breathe slowly and not to panic. After his condition stabilized, he attacked the princess with fury. He grabbed her by the throat and said that everyone who knew about his illness in the palace was immediately killed. He looked at her with fury and asked if she understood what he was getting at. The prince said that she should not even spread about it. He said with fury that if she dared to tell anyone about it, he would kill her immediately, and then the butler would die, and then the one who recently dared to contradict him. A moment later, the prince let go of the young lady who fell to the ground. With a thud, he looked at her with disdain and said that he was looking forward to the day when he could kill her. Joseph quickly ran up to the princess and asked if she was okay or not trembling. She said that she was okay. With tears in her eyes, Alexia looked after the prince. The princess sighed heavily because she became very scared. The prince was taken aback by the news early in the morning. He told him that he had heard that Her Highness from the Rain family had died. The young man said that he knew that the time was not right, but Her Majesty the Empress had told him to tell him this. The prince asked, puzzled, why people were so fragile and constantly dying. He looked closely at his servant and asked how she died. The young man sighed heavily and said that she died at a horse riding competition. He looked at the prince intently and said that she accidentally fell off her horse, and the prince froze in shock. He remembered the young lady telling him that she didn't love him at all. She said with a radiant smile that they unfortunately were in similar situations, so she thought that they could at least be friends. The prince remembered the young lady with tenderness and warmth. Jubilian looked at his subordinate with fury and shouted at him to tell him the truth at least once. Jubilian threw an object at the young man. In a fury, it injured his servant, but he did not move. He looked intently at the prince and said that he had already told him the pure truth. After this news, the prince had a fit and began to breathe heavily. The young man quickly ran up to the prince. He screamed and called him. He shouted that he needed to take medicine. The prince said that he didn't need it. The young man shouted that he needed to drink his medicine quickly. Jubilian shouted at him not to come near. He was furious and did not understand why his assistant always listened to his mother's words. He remembered the princess telling him to breathe slowly and deeply. He tried to breathe slowly, but it wasn't that easy. He remembered how the princess, with warmth and tenderness, told him to breathe slowly and not to worry about anything. He froze in place because it seemed to him that she was next to him. A moment later, he was taken aback and froze in place from shock. He sighed heavily as he realized that her method had worked. The young man froze in place from shock and, looking at the prince, wondered how he managed to overcome the attack. The prince looked closely at his subordinate and told him to get ready. The prince looked at the young man with a satisfied smile and said that they would go to meet the princess. The young lady read the note slowly, looked closely at her servant, and asked if her mother had really been poisoned. Joseph sighed heavily and said that he also wanted to know if this was true. The princess froze in place in surprise. She did not know what to say or how to behave. Joseph looked at the princess intently. He asked her if she had a way to see her mother. What would she do? Joseph said that she could just go back to her kingdom. She looked at him in surprise and asked how this could be accomplished. He looked at her and said that she just needed to trust him. The princess did not let him finish and interrupted him. She looked at the young man intently and asked him to stop giving her false hope. She was confused and did not know how she could get there quickly and still remain unnoticed. She screamed and called for her mother. She looked closely at the young man and said that, unfortunately, there was no guarantee that her mother was alive. He called her and tried to calm her down. She said that she could not get out of here alive. She told the young man that unfortunately there was no way out. He looked at the young princess closely and said that she was wrong about that. He said that if they could get to the nearest village to their kingdom, then they would be completely safe. He shouted that they were far from that village. There was his fork, which he got from his grandfather, on his mother's side. And if they got there and she waited for him there, he would quickly go to the palace and bring the queen to her. He looked closely at the princess and shouted that he was not afraid to risk his life. If necessary, he would sacrifice it. If only she was safe and sound, he would like her to get to the kingdom and meet her mother. A moment later, she heard someone calling her, and she recoiled from her servant. Turning around, she saw her knight. The knight looked at them in surprise and asked Joseph why he came to this place. A moment later, there was silence between them, the princess frozen in place from shock. Gaster looked at them closely and said that if they were planning a secret conversation, they should have chosen the time and place better. The princess looked at her servant and shouted at him to cross himself. A moment later, the knight attacked the servant and they began to fight. After a few minutes of fighting, the young man's disguise fell, and he appeared before everyone in his true form. Gaster looked at the young man with a grin. He said that he didn't even expect that Joseph was so good with weapons. He looked closely at the young man and asked if he really did any fencing. The knight struck with lightning speed. Joseph recoiled after the brutal blow. The young lady, in turn, froze in place from shock and surprise as she saw that there was a tough fight. She noticed that Gaster knocked the weapon away from the young man. The knight looked at the young man with fury and rushed towards him, shouting that he must die. Joseph, in turn, used magic with lightning speed and thus protected himself. The knight looked at the young man in surprise, as he was surprised that he turned out to be a magician. Joseph decided not to continue the fight. He ran away with lightning speed. He ran past the princess and said that he would come to her later. He said that she should wait for him in her room. The princess in turn looked after him intently. She did not answer. Frozen with shock, she wondered if her knight had known they were here from the start. She wondered if he had heard their entire conversation. A moment later, he came closer to her and said that her outfit was dirty. Alexia looked at her knight intently and muttered her servant's name. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he was the only one she cared about at the moment. He looked at her intently and said that he thought she should worry about her life first. She wondered for a moment if her death would be the same as in the original story. She looked at the knight intently and asked if he was going to kill her. She sighed heavily and said that he could kill her since she was perfectly fine. Gaster looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that she hadn't done anything and he wasn't even going to kill her. He said that he was ordered not to harm the princess under any circumstances. Alexei asked, "Is it true that he won't kill her?" After she talked to the spy, Gaster said that everything was correct. She looked at the knight intently and asked, "Since when did he know about this?" She sighed heavily and asked if he really knew about everything. After Prince Jubilian arrived, Gaster said that was true. He said that it seemed that the king of her country loved the princess very much because it was quite difficult to send a spy. He asked if she didn't know about it. He said that the young man had lived in the castle for 4 years in order to fit in with the group and not show suspicion. The young lady was surprised because she did not expect the young man to live in the castle for so long. She thought for a moment about the life of a young man in such conditions because she thought that he had lived here for many years, and they were all like hell. She knew that he had suffered loneliness, hatred, pain for many years because of her. She mentally called his name Gaster, looked at the princess and said that his name was actually Lionel Helbert. She repeated his name several times. He looked at the princess intently and said that she would have to stay in her room for a while until they found the spy. The princess looked at him intently and agreed with him. He looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she didn't want to run away following Joseph. She sighed heavily, but did not answer the question asked. The knight realized that he would not wait for an answer, and a moment later, he said that she could tell him nothing, but still it was time for him to go, and she could rest. The princess was in shock and despair. She didn't know what to do in this situation. She hurried out onto the terrace and thought about her mother. Madame looked closely at her daughter and said with a soft smile that her father would come soon. But young Alexia knew that this was just a funny story. Some waited all their lives, and some ignored those who waited all their lives. She smiled and told her mother that everything was just like that. Then the young lady was very happy. She knew that even if her father never wanted to see her, didn't want to know how she was, she had a mother who hugged her warmly. So for her now, the only thing that mattered was her mother, whom she loved very much. The young lady did not want to die at all, according to the novel. But she knew that if she could protect her mother with her death, then she was completely willing to do so. She knew that if she could get out of the castle, then her friend would help her take her mother. She knew that if everything worked out, she would definitely leave the castle. A moment later, she froze in place in surprise as she saw a young man. She looked at him intently and asked in surprise how he managed to climb onto the terrace. He looked at the princess and said that they should leave quickly, since in a few days a ship would arrive that would cross the border. Alexia sighed heavily and said that she would not go. She looked at the young man and said that he would not be caught if he ran away alone. He sighed heavily and said that he would not go anywhere without her. Alexia looked at him intently and told him to stop. She said that if she went with him, he would be in danger. She asked him to leave and save her mother. She looked at him intently and said that the most important thing was for him to save her mother and take her to a safe place. She turned around and went to her room, but the young man called her. He sighed heavily and, looking away from the princess, said that it was too late. She froze in shock and surprise. But a moment later, she looked at the young man with a look of surprise. He said that he knew that this would not be an easy path. He took the princess by the hands and asked her to trust him. He said that he would not let anyone harm her. Alexia was in shock. She didn't understand what was happening. She called him. Moments later, he told her to stop and be quiet. Frozen in place, they stared at the door. He quietly said that there was someone behind the door. They heard the young people, who hoped that the princess was sleeping. They entered the room and stared at the princess, who was pretending to be asleep. The young knights were furious. They were disgusted to be in the room where the princess was. They wanted to do everything quickly, because they knew that the guards would come soon. They wanted to do everything quickly before she woke up. The young lady was puzzled and jumped out of bed with lightning speed as she realized that they were approaching her. A moment later, they heard a noise and looked intently at the bed on which the princess had recently been lying. The young people were furious because they realized that there was someone else in the room. The princess looked at the young people with fury and asked who they were and why they had come to her room. The young man looked at the princess intently and said that if she agreed to follow them quietly, nothing terrible would happen. He said that he promised her this. She looked at him intently and asked why she should blindly believe his words. He sighed heavily and looked angrily at the princess because he knew that just a little bit more, and their plan would have succeeded. Alexia looked at the young man intently, as she had seen somewhere before the sword that was in his hands. She looked at him intently and said that he was the knight who followed the prince. Z's hand with lightning speed and fury, and said that he really hoped that he would not be so bored playing with her. The princess looked at the young man with fury and said that even if she seemed weak to him, she would not tolerate such rude treatment. Alexia angrily hit the young man in the face. He was shocked because he did not expect this. He looked at the princess with anger because he saw that she was behaving very fearlessly. He looked at her with contempt and asked if she didn't understand who was standing in front of her now. The princess said that if he didn't let her go right away, she would call the guards. The young man looked at the princess with a grin and said that she was very stupid to think that the guards would take her and help her. She looked at him and said that she would tell them that he tried to harm her. The young man looked at the princess with fury and began to draw his sword. He shouted that she was talking too much. The princess in turn froze in place. She was afraid that she would be killed now. The princess was shocked. She knew it was very dangerous. She recoiled when the young man began to attack her with a sword in his hands. The young man looked at the princess with fury and a grin. He was amused by the game. He attacked her slowly while her friend was under the bed. The knight ran with lightning speed as he wanted to catch the princess. The princess was lying under the bed with her friend. Alexia trembled with fear as he covered her mouth with his hand. A moment later, the young man caught the knight, preventing him from attacking the princess. His friend was shocked. He did not expect to see a young man. Meanwhile, the young lady stood quietly to the side, trembling with fear. She closed her eyes so as not to see what was happening. Some time later, she opened her eyes as she heard her friend calling her. She looked intently at the young man and asked if the knights were no longer there. He looked at the princess and said that they had run away with their tails between their legs. Joseph looked at her closely and said that it seemed that they had decided to send assassins after her. He sighed heavily, and looking at the princess said that unfortunately she could no longer trust anyone. She said that her knight was somewhere nearby. She wondered if there were more of Jubilian's men outside. He looked at the princess and said that there was no one outside. Now she sighed heavily and said that was very good. The princess told her friend that he had already been seen and they must separate. He cried out that it was too reckless. He said that she must be safe, and for that reason, she must go with him. He sighed heavily, and looking at the princess, said that he did not even know which of them was more reckless. Moments later, he changed his appearance. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this disguise would be enough. Some time later, they walked slowly through the castle. Fortunately, no one approached them. The princess slowly left the castle. She looked closely at her friend and asked if he could lend her a dagger. He looked at the princess and said that he would do it, but she had to be careful with him. He said that she couldn't get hurt. The young man looked at the princess in bewilderment, as he did not understand why she needed a dagger. Moments later, she cut her finger. He looked at the princess in surprise, as he was not prepared for something like this. She looked at him in surprise and created everything, asked if this was another illusion. She asked him if her father had told him to come here. He sighed heavily and said that it was not so, since he had come of his own free will. She said that she had decided to trust him, so he should answer honestly. She asked why he suddenly wanted to accompany her home. She knew that the guards were still there. She just didn't see them. Alexia knew that. Perhaps even the road leading to that saving place was also fake. He looked closely at the princess and asked if she trusted him. Then why couldn't she trust him without asking? The princess looked at the young man closely and said that she really wanted him to be safe. She said that he had almost died several times. Even when she ran alone, he miraculously managed to escape. She said that he himself should understand that he would not be able to do this with her. She said that it would be easier for him if he went alone. She looked at the young man intently and said that she would get to the mansion herself so he could go without her. The young man sighed heavily and said with a smile that it seemed he would have to tell her the whole truth and bring her into the present. He smiled and extended his hand to her. She smiled and agreed to his demands, but a moment later she heard a sound. She froze in surprise as she realized that the magic had already been broken. He looked at the young princess and called her. The young man was very scared. He shouted that she should hide behind him. The prince looked at the young man with fury and said that he had finally found him. He looked intently at the princess and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. Alexia looked at her future husband with a smile. All she could do was call him by name, but a moment later, there was a dead silence between them. Joseph was shocked because he saw that his friend was next to the prince. The prince looked at them with fury and asked where they were going to go. The princess looked at the prince intently and said in a calm manner that she was going to go to an estate located near the village. He looked at her intently and said that it looked very much like that very road. He said with a grin that it looked like she was lying very beautifully. The princess looked at the prince and said that she was under the influence of magic and did not recognize that she was going in the wrong direction. It was for this reason that she didn't want to run away at all in the first place. She knew that even if she tried to explain everything to him, her words would sound like a pathetic excuse. He looked closely at the princess and asked if she had been poisoned since she was ill. She said that she had not been poisoned at all, and that she had only hallucinations. The prince looked closely at the princess and asked if they were trying to harm her under their influence. She sighed heavily and said that this was not so. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that if she was not poisoned, then she was simply crazy. He shouted furiously that it was all very funny. He said that her father's knights had turned into corpses, and she was just an impudent rat who suffered from hallucinations. The prince looked at the young man with fury and said that the main character of this disgusting scene was a spy who was furiously trying to protect his princess while killing his people. The prince looked at the young man with cold fury and said that he knew perfectly well whose territory he was on. He did not understand how the young man dared to kill his man. The prince told the young man that he seemed to have already guessed that the price of such an offense was certain death. With lightning speed, the prince began to attack the young man. Joseph managed to dodge. The young lady in turn fell to the ground nearby. She froze in shock on the spot. The princess was very afraid and trembled. She watched the battle with horror. She didn't know what to do in this situation. She looked at her friend intently and called out to him as she was very worried. She saw that he was breathing heavily and was feeling unwell. The prince looked at the young man with a grin and said that he looked like he had used a scroll of destruction. He asked him with a grin if this was all that the best warrior could show. Alexia, in turn, understood perfectly well that she did not want to die now. It was here that she understood perfectly well that she needed to run as quickly as possible. The prince was very frightened and excited. He called the young lady. She turned around when he screamed. A moment later, Joseph grabbed the princess. He put a knife to her throat. Looking at the prince, he said that if he made even one move, he would kill her. The prince looked at the young man with surprise and bewilderment and said with rage that it seemed he so strongly desired death. He was surprised that the knight of the kingdom, instead of protecting his princess, took her prisoner. The prince told the young man that he would do better to stop this nonsense and let her go quickly. Joseph quietly told the princess that she must forgive him. Alexia, in turn, did not answer him, but trembled with fear. Joseph looked at the prince with fury and asked what difference it made. He shouted at the prince that the princess was sent to die anyway, and it made no difference now who did it. He shouted at the prince that if he wanted her to survive, he must not come any closer. The prince froze in place for a moment. The prince understood perfectly well that this was all a simple manipulation. He slowly stepped forward and took one step. At the same time, Joseph made a cut on the princess's neck. Alexia involuntarily screamed. The prince saw this sight. His eyes blazed with rage. He quickly ordered his knights to stop. The knights shouted to the prince that it was very dangerous, but he shouted for them not to move and not to do anything. The prince looked intently at the young lady and called her. She looked at him in surprise, frozen in place. She wondered why he was calling her in such a sad voice. She remembered the scene from the novel, where the prince shouted furiously at the princess and said that there was no one else and she would be killed right now. She looked at the prince intently. She knew that he was a very cruel man, but she did not understand why he was sad. Alexia looked at him intently and called tenderly. At the same time, the prince cried out, and with rage and despair, he called the princess. Due to the furious outburst of anger, his power went out of control. Joseph was shocked because he did not expect this. With lightning speed, he grabbed the princess and quickly ran into the forest. But in turn, the princess reached out to the prince. She heard him calling her, but it was all in vain. The young man ran away in a hurry with the princess in his arms. A moment later, he accidentally tripped and dropped. The Princess Alexia fell to the ground with a crash. She screamed as if she was in great pain. Joseph looked closely at the princess and asked worriedly if she was okay. She sighed heavily and, looking at her friend, said that she was fine and asked how he was feeling. Joseph sighed heavily and said that he was fine too. The princess said with sadness in her voice that she needed to return to the castle immediately. He looked at her in surprise and said that it would be very dangerous to return to the castle. She knew this. He looked at her intently and said that they had to go. She froze in place, not knowing what to do. A moment later, she said that she didn't want to go anywhere at all. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't trust him anymore. The prince looked at the knight and asked if he had checked the entire stable. The knight said that all the horses were in their places, but the carts were badly damaged. He said that the wheels were also missing. The prince listened carefully to the report and was very irritated. A moment later, he looked with cold fury at the knight who lay beside him. He looked at the knight and said that since the horses were not touched, it meant that they had fled on foot. He looked at the young man and asked with cold fury in his voice why the carriages had been broken. He struck the young man, who froze in shock and, trembling with fear, said that he knew nothing. Turvian P. looked at the young man and asked where his friend had taken the princess. He dealt him blow after blow. The man looked at the prince intently and said that the interrogation was dragging on. He said that at this rate the young man would not answer the questions and would simply die. Turvian S. told the man not to worry about it. He looked at the young man with cold fury and said that he had no intention of killing him. The man understood perfectly well that, judging by the prince's look, this was exactly what he was going to do. The prince grabbed the young man by the throat, and he froze in place from pain and shock. The prince looked at the young man with a grin and told him to choose: either he would drink all his blood and cut him into pieces, or make him rot alive. He looked at the young man with a mocking look and said that he should not worry, since he had a chance to save his life. He looked at the young man with fury and said that he would ask again, and it would be the last time he wanted to know where his friend was planning to take the princess. The young man screamed. He didn't understand what he cared about them at all. He screamed that for all of them, she was nothing more than a toy. He screamed that they would simply kill her. The prince sighed heavily, and looking at the young man, said that this was simply ridiculous. He told the young man that he didn't even have to make him laugh, since he knew that they didn't care about the princess. Turvian asked the young man if he really thought that he didn't know that, for them, she was a pawn that they had decided to just throw away. The prince said that if he wanted to keep his language, then he should tell everything right now. The young man was in shock. He shouted at the prince that he was just crazy. He did not understand why someone like him would bring back the princess of a foreign country. The prince looked at the young man with fury and said that his mouth reeked of slop. Turvian was very angry. He squeezed the young man very hard and said that anyone who dared to be rude to him or go against him would face inevitable death. The young man shouted that he followed orders to protect the princess. The prince looked at him in surprise and asked if he really thought he would believe his words. The young man was surprised. He did not understand why the princess left the prince alive. He screamed because he wanted her to kill him. He didn't understand why she did this. Because of his words, the prince became even more angry. The prince looked at his knights and told them to bring him the horse. He said that they needed to find them before they left the forest. Ludwig looked at the prince and said that he could release hunting dogs on them. The prince said that they did not need any hunting dogs, since he himself would go looking for them. Ludwig was shocked. He did not expect to hear something like this. He shouted to the prince, but it was all in vain. Ludwig looked at the prince intently and said excitedly that an army had been sent from the center. The prince looked at him in surprise and asked why they had done this. Ludwig said that for disobeying the order and for treason, he said that the prince should also be urgently taken to the capital. The prince looked at the man in surprise and asked who could have reported him. Ludwig said that he knew nothing about it. The prince told his friend that, judging by his reaction, it could only be his brother. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that in order for his brother to calm down, he needed to kill the empress. Ludwig looked at the prince and asked him to take care of himself. Ludwig asked the prince to try not to lose his temper too much, as it could harm him. The prince said with fury that he did not care about anything for him. The initial task is to find the young lady. The princess looked closely at her friend and said that it seemed that he needed to take a little rest. The young man asked the princess for forgiveness. A moment later, he said with fury that he was poisoned. Joseph was angry with himself. He didn't understand how he dared to put her in danger. She sighed heavily and said that the most important thing was that they were trying to move on and they were still alive. Joseph said that if they moved on, they would finally reach shelter. Some time later, they finally came to the hut. She looked closely at the small house and said that it looked like they had arrived. Sometime later, the young lady lit a fire in the room to warm herself. Meanwhile, Joseph was writhing in pain. The princess looked at her friend excitedly and called him. The young man smiled and looked intently at the princess. He did not want her to see him like this. She came closer to him and said that she wanted to look at his wound. He sighed heavily and said that she should wait a little since he was about to take off his clothes. Alexia looked closely at the young man. She saw that his whole body was shaking. She understood perfectly well that he would not be able to do this. She sighed heavily and said that she would help him right away. The young man looked at her in surprise, but still agreed. A moment later, she had undressed him, Joseph, writhing in pain. Alexia looked closely at the young man and said that he needed to be patient for a little while. She, with the speed of lightning, pressed on his wound, and he involuntarily made sounds. Some time later, she treated his wound. The princess looked closely at her friend and said that everything was ready. Joseph looked at the princess in surprise and said that the passerby had already done the treatment and dressing of wounds. Before Alexia sighed heavily and said that her mother was often sick, so no one cared about them, and she had to take care of her. She said that she stole potions, medicinal ones, which they would never give to her. He sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, asked if she was really offended by the king. The princess did not answer the question asked, but a moment later, she said that she did not now, and she did not care anymore. She said that there were times when she felt something for him. Alexia said that she had no choice but to leave the country at the whim of her father. She sighed heavily and said that she still plans to come back someday. The young lady said that now she only has her mother left from her family. She doesn't want to see anyone else, and the others in the family have long been dead to her. She said that she thinks that she, the little one who once dreamed of a complete and happy family, is just a silly girl. Joseph looked at the princess and said that she was not stupid at all. He said that she should not talk about herself like that. The princess smiled and asked if he was really speaking honestly now. He looked at her and said that it was exactly like that. Joseph looked at the princess intently and said that she had the right to be happy. Alexia froze in place. In surprise, she did not expect to hear such a thing. She smiled and asked if a knight could really put such a sweet meaning into his words. She smiled and said that he could be expelled from the kingdom's knights. Joseph slowly reached closer to the princess and touched her face. Alexia froze in surprise on the spot. He asked for forgiveness for hurting her. He hoped that there would be no scar. The princess looked closely at the young man and said that he should not worry, as everything was fine. She said that he should take better care of himself, as he needed quick treatment. She said that he should rest. He pulled her hand. The princess looked at the young man in surprise and called him by name. He looked at her intently and said that his name was actually Rayanel. She looked at the young man in surprise and called him by name. He froze in place. She said his real name several more times, softly and with a smile. He smiled, and looking at the princess, said that everything was correct. The young man looked at the princess intently, with a smile on his face, but a moment later he let go of her hand. He glanced sideways at the princess and said that they needed to hurry before it started raining again. She was surprised, looked at him as she was very worried. The princess said that he had a high temperature. She said that he should rest a little more. He sighed heavily and said that if they stayed for a long time, it could become dangerous to move further. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything the princess said that they needed to change before leaving. She looked closely at the scrolls and asked if she could use this. He turned around and asked what she was talking about. The young lady sat quietly on the ground and hugged the scrolls tightly. The young man was shocked because she was almost naked. The princess was taken aback and said that she would cover herself now. A moment later, the princess handed over all her scrolls to the young man. He looked closely at the scroll and said that they were enchanted, and for the magic to work, you needed to know the starting word. She froze for a moment, not knowing who had done it, but suddenly she remembered the prince. He looked closely at the young lady, who spoke the words that could be used. He smiled and said that it all depended on the person who wished to use the scroll, and he could not know. A moment later, they realized that they could do nothing with the scrolls. They slowly left the hut. The young lady turned around sadly and looked at the hut as she had originally not wanted to run away. She wondered if she had gone back and changed her mind. How many people in the castles would have believed in her innocence? She knew that if she got away from dangerous places, she would live in peace. She hoped that she could avoid the terrible end of the original story. She wondered how she would feel when she got there. The young lady stood quietly behind the door and watched Ophelia. She knew that Ophelia was very good. She looked like an angel and kept smiling in a friendly way. And her father liked all this very much, and he hugged her and kissed her tightly. But for a moment she seemed very frightening to her. The madam looked into the distance with empty eyes and asked if His Majesty had arrived. Alexia looked at her mother and said that, unfortunately, he did not come. Madame said with a smile on her face that she heard that the king was coming to her. She asked her daughter if she could bring her some beautiful clothes. The girl looked at her mother intently and said with a smile that she did not need anything as she was already beautiful. Madame asked her daughter to bring her a mirror as she wanted to look at herself. She said that she really liked the way she looked now. Alexia slowly brought her mother a mirror. Madame looked into the mirror with admiration and admired herself. She looked at her mother and said with a smile that the king was with Ophelia in the garden again today. She asked her mother whether she had listened to her or not. Looking at her mother, she said that when she saw her like this, old memories came back. She said that in fact she had a previous life, and she knew the story in advance from a book. She asked her mother with a smile on her face if she could even believe it. A moment later, she arched up and said it was probably just a dream. She said she must have started seeing strange things because she was hungry. She spoke about her mother, that she felt very bad, because she would have to die before Ophelia met that man. The young lady woke up from the sound of her mother calling her. She looked at her mother in bewilderment. The madam looked at her daughter and asked if the king had come to see them. A moment later, she said with a smile that he had not come to them. Madame was surprised, for he had said that he would come to her as soon as the sun went down. She thought that she should spruce herself up a little. Alexia told her mother that he had not come to them all this time. Alexia hugged her mother tightly and said that she saw that there was a free carriage now. She asked her mother if they should try to escape. She said that they would succeed. She told her mother that she should comb her hair even if she didn't like it. She asked her mother if she would go with her. Madame smiled and said that plum was his favorite fruit. She asked her daughter if she could spray her with plum perfume. The young lady was furious. She screamed that father would not come to them. She screamed that he never intended to come to them, and he would not even come to them, even if she died. The madam looked at her daughter with fury and told her to shut her mouth. The young lady froze in place in surprise, as her mother had never treated her like that before. The madame looked at her daughter with fury and asked how she dared to say such a thing. She said that the king himself told her that he liked her. She said that she even has a child from him, and no one will dare to touch this child, because it is proof of his love for her. She said that when he comes to her, they will leave that big palace. She said that no one will be allowed to touch her until that moment. The young lady was in shock. Her mother scared her very much. The lady screamed at her daughter with rage and tears in her eyes. She said that she was sent by that woman, and that she was a simple fake. She screamed and begged for someone to save her and help her. Alexia, in turn, decided that she needed to quickly run away from her mother. She ran as she understood that she needed to run away quickly. She knew that if she ran away, then she would escape from her sad fate. She froze in place when she saw the cart. She knew that if she could only get on, she could escape. The young lady stood frozen in place. She didn't know what to do. At the same time, the lady was screaming and calling for her daughter. She was very confused, did not understand where she had gone, and in a fit of anger, she accidentally cut herself. Alexia, in turn, stood on the street and cried bitterly. The maids whispered among themselves, wondering if the woman really wanted to fake the disappearance of the child. They said that she was crazy, but they were amazed by her actions. They said that the young lady was of royal blood, but she had long since lost favor. The madam looked intently at her daughter and called her. The lady asked her daughter where she had run off to, as she was very worried about her. She looked intently at her daughter, and hugging her, said that she should not go anywhere else. The young lady, in turn, looked at her mother with tears in her eyes. She was furious, because she knew that fate had her completely chained, and whether it had predicted that she would not be able to escape at all. She was furious because she knew that her fate had already been decided long ago. The young lady moved slowly. A moment later, she stopped and looked intently at the young man. He, breathing heavily, told the princess that she must go on her own. He said that he would follow her a little later. He said that she should leave him and go forward. She looked closely at the young man as she understood his condition. The princess sighed heavily and said that in that case she should go further. She said that as soon as he rested, he should catch up with her. She understood perfectly well that if he were in her place, he would do the same as she did. The princess looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that he must definitely survive. Trembling, he told the princess that he would definitely survive. The princess in turn left him with a heavy heart and went on. She really wanted God to help her. Then her cursing and indignation would stop completely. She was in shock and wondered if she was going to die in the forest. She was running through the forest when she accidentally tripped and her son fell to the ground with a crash. She was puzzled and knew that this was not a funny joke at all. The young lady ran like lightning, and when she turned around, she saw that a beast was chasing her. She was shocked because she saw a pack of wolves behind her, the princess, with the speed of lightning without a sting. A moment later, she froze in shock, as she did not understand why she thought of this now. She knew that she still had one chance to save herself. She knew that he simply couldn't be meant for Ophelia. She remembered how the prize had said that no one could kill her as long as he was around. She cried out his name with the speed of lightning, and a bright light rang out throughout the forest. The young lady in turn froze in surprise when she saw the prince in front of her. He looked at her in surprise and called out. The prince slowly approached the princess. He was very glad to see her. He looked intently at the princess and said that she called him. The princess looked at the prince with sadness, but a moment later, unable to bear it, she collapsed into his arms. The search for the princess was successful, and she was eventually found. He was glad that he had arrived before the king's army. In the castle, the knights of the two princes began to actively show their hostility to each other. This happened because of the emperor's army, which was supposed to arrive in a matter of days. According to Ludwig, his words were twisted. The prince was furious because now he understood what really happened. The young men gathered for a council. They were furious because they did not understand how they could commit treason if they fought to the last. Gaster looked closely at all the knights present as he saw their displeasure. He remembered the moment when the prince returned with the princess in his arms. The prince looked at the young lady with tenderness and care. He sighed heavily and shouted at everyone else to stop talking nonsense. Everyone present was shocked as they were accused of treason. They were furious as the prince was defending the princess of an enemy country. They quarreled with each other because everyone had their own opinion on this matter. A little more, and it would have come to a fight. He sighed heavily as he knew that their prince could not do such a thing to the princess. He knew that the prince hated the whole of Anzac country very much, and all the people who were there. He understood perfectly well that if he remembered exactly this, then everything would immediately become clear. Callie looked at the knight closely and said that it looked like he was going to fight Harbekia. He was furious because he couldn't do anything, because they saw them as traitors. She looked at him intently and asked what would happen next. He froze in place, not knowing what to answer. She looked at him intently and said that if he was going to kill the emperor, he must kill him, but if the attempt was futile, he would simply become a traitor. She wanted to know what he was going to do if he couldn't win. He looked at her intently and said that then they would destroy Anzac. She looked at her in surprise, asked if he really wanted to do that. While the emperor was a little loyal to them, she said that he should think with his own brains. She looked at the young man intently and said that His Majesty had already given up the idea of taking over the kingdom. He looked at her in surprise and confusion and asked when she had learned of this. She said that sending an army meant this. She said that if he still didn't understand this, then he was just stupid. She said that transferring the prince to the capital meant ending the war. Gaster was in shock. He couldn't believe it. He screamed that it was just madness. Killy sighed heavily and walked away, but her friends continued to shout after her for a long time. She sighed heavily and wondered if the prince was serious about stopping the war. She knew that even if it was revenge, it couldn't be that simple. She sighed heavily as she thought that his long-time dream could be considered fulfilled. She knew that it seemed like it would be a thing of the past. A moment later, she knocked on the door and asked if the prince was inside. A moment later, she entered the room and asked how the princess was feeling. The prince sighed and said that she seemed to be feeling much better. Killy looked at the prince intently and said that it was very good. Tervion looked intently at his subordinate. He did not answer her. Looking out the window, he asked her why she had come after all. She looked at the prince intently and said that the army should arrive in a few days. He sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. She was taken aback and froze in surprise. She knew that he himself told her that he wanted to destroy the king. She knew that these were his words, but she did not understand why the princess was now alive and well. She looked at the princess intently, for she knew that, if it were as he said, he should have sent the princess to another country. The princess looked at her with fury. He was going to just sit quietly and watch this situation. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really suggesting that he destroy the emperor's army. She said that he could call the knights from the fortress to defend himself. He looked at her intently and said that it made no sense since it would not delay his move. He said that no one here could challenge the will of the ruler. She screamed that, nevertheless, it was necessary to defend one's rights. After all, it was immutable. The prince slowly approached her. She forced herself to do so as she saw his intent gaze on her. She looked closely at the prince as she saw that he was smiling. She said that he should just punish the princess now. Killy! She said that in that case, it would no longer be considered treason, or a decision on his punishment would not be considered, and everything would be decided before the arrival of the king's army. He turned away and said that they could do whatever they wanted, and she could punish him for any other moment. She screamed that it would be too late later. She asked if he really wanted an army to surround the castle. She screamed that they would definitely use the princess as an excuse, and they could accuse him of treason. She was furious and didn't understand why the prince was deliberately trying to protect the princess at such a cost. He looked at her sideways and said that he had already given her an answer and was not going to repeat himself. She screamed in rage that he was not even trying to stand up for himself and was ruining everything because of some princess. She screamed that the princess was a Neva that they were putting him in. He angrily told her to shut her mouth. Killy froze in place in surprise. He looked at her intently and said with fury in his eyes that if she said one more word about his decision or about the princess, he would never forgive her in his life. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked what she should do. He said that she should leave the room immediately, as it was intended only for patients. A moment later, she meekly agreed with him and bowing left. The prince looked at her closely and asked if she remembered who she was truly loyal to. He looked at her intently and said that she should never forget this. She walked out the door and froze for a moment as she understood perfectly well that everything was happening because of the princess. She once had an old dream. Madame in delirium asked her daughter if the king had come. The young lady ran as fast as she could, wherever her eyes looked. She wanted to find her father and call him. Meanwhile, the king sat with his daughter and had a pleasant conversation. The lady looked at him intently and said that, unfortunately, the tulips had already dried up. He said that was very sad, and also asked what he should plant next time. She smiled and said that he could plant roses, as she liked bright red roses. He smiled and said that he would do anything. Meanwhile, the young lady rushed to her father with tears in her eyes. The lady looked at her father and asked with a smile if they would be more beautiful than her. He said that this was not so, and there was no one and nothing more beautiful than her. The young lady in turn did not reach them and fell. Ophelia looked at her father and said that it seemed that someone had come. The king looked at everyone present in surprise and asked what was going on. Alexia screamed furiously at her father that her mother was very ill. She asked the king for help, but he looked at her silently. Ophelia looked at the young lady with a grin and called out to her. She slowly walked closer to her and said with a smile that she was very sorry that she had to meet her sister in this way. She smiled and said that she would pray for her sister. Alexia froze in place in surprise. Ophelia looked at the young lady with a grin and said that, of course, she was very sorry for her sister, as it was a great loss. Alexia froze in surprise looking at her sister. She saw her fake smile. Alexia couldn't utter a word. She saw a white, beautiful coffin and a flock of birds in the sky. Sometime later, it was announced that the princess's condolences would be read. Alexia looked at them in shock without moving away from the coffin. She looked at her sister with tears in her eyes as she realized that she was just a hypocrite. Ophelia, with a smile on her face, said that she would like her sister to be ennobled, caught as she felt very sorry for her. The young princess knew that everyone around her was just a hypocrite. She remembered the prince's look, asking her if she really liked him. She was shaking with fear and writhing in pain as she was having a simply terrible nightmare. Killy screamed, "I'll bring it, that it was an escape." not a kidnapping. The prince said that she definitely had a reason to escape. She shouted at the prince that he would not be able to cover up all the traces. She begged him to punish the princess. She was writhing in pain as she saw her mother in a dream. She understood perfectly well that it seemed she would soon die. She remembered her friend, who asked her not to lose hope anymore. She heard in her sleep that someone was calling her. The prince looked closely at the princess and said that she should open her eyes quickly. She woke up from a terrible nightmare that had tormented her for a long time. The young lady woke up and saw a strange man in front of her. She froze in horror. The young man looked closely at the princess and said that her body temperature had returned to normal. A moment later, he said that she was fine, and there was no need to worry. The princess froze in place. She understood that she was saved. She remembered the moment when the prince hugged her. She froze in place as she wondered where the prince was now. She wondered if her friend was safe, as she was very worried about him. The young man looked at her intently and said that he was a priest, and she did not need to be afraid of him. He looked at her intently and, sighing heavily, said that it seemed that all the people here did not know how to listen at all. Killy looked at the priest intently and asked if he had finished his examination. He said that he had finished everything. She looked at the priest intently and asked if the princess needed to go to bed already. The priest was shocked by such words. He looked at her intently and said that she was behaving like a little child. She sighed heavily and said that he was only saying that because she had been lying in bed for several days. The princess stood frozen in shock, looking at Killy. She couldn't do anything. Killy looked at the princess and asked if she wanted water. The princess turned her gaze away from her and said that she did not need anything. She looked at the princess and said that it had been several days since she had fainted. She said that she thought the princess couldn't have known about such a thing, but during that time, while she was unconscious, a lot had happened. She looked at the princess and said that she had promised not to do anything stupid, but in the end, she had made a mistake of a large scale. The priest looked at her intently and said that she should stop arguing with the patient already. She looked at the princess with fury and said that she had made a huge mistake and that she was no longer a patient but a sinner. She walked away from them with fury. Killy was very angry with the princess because she understood that she made a huge mistake, and now because of her, they all have problems. The young lady in turn knew that she was not yet a criminal, but would soon become one. She sighed heavily because she knew that at least she was alive, and everything could be fixed. She knew that the prince had found her and seemed to have decided to let her go. She told herself that it was not that easy. He did not want to give her a chance to die in the forest. She knew that he would criticize her. The princess looked at the priest and asked where the prince was now. The priest looked at Killy and asked how she was feeling now. She looked at me in surprise and asked if he really meant her peace of mind. She said that he could wait a little longer and contact her later. She said that there were no plans to repair the castle in the winter at all. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was joking. A moment later, the prince entered the room and everyone greeted him. The young lady in turn froze in shock on the spot. As she realized that the prince had come to her, the prince asked the priest how the princess was feeling. The priest said that it seemed to the general public that her health was safe and she had managed to avoid pneumonia. However, it seemed that it would take some time to recover her health because her body was very weak. The prince asked if she was still unconscious. The priest said that the princess had just woken up. While he was checking her condition, she froze in place listening to their conversation. The prince slowly approached the princess. She looked at him intently as she was very scared. The prince asked the priest if the treatment was finished. The priest said that he had finished everything. The prince looked sideways at the priest and said that in that case, he could go. The priest said, "I will bring it, that since the princess is in a weakened state, it is better for them to postpone all conversations." The prince angrily told the priest to leave. A moment later, everyone left them, and they were left alone with each other. The prince approached the young lady with lightning speed. She froze in shock. Looking into his eyes, she timidly said that it was already night. He looked at her intently and said that everything was correct, and it was already night. He said that she need not worry and could lie down peacefully. The princess sighed heavily, and looking at the prince asked if he was really going to kill her. He looked at the princess with cold fury and said that if he wanted to kill her, he would have done it long ago. She understood perfectly well that he thought that she had an affair with the knight and her kingdom. He said that while she lay unconscious, he managed to find several rabbit holes, as well as scrolls and weapons. He said in a dull voice that still a good job of preparing the shelter was done in such a hurry. He looked at her intently and said that his knights say that they still have not managed to find the body of that traitor. The princess looked at him in surprise. He looked at the princess with cold fury and asked why she ran away from him. The princess froze in place. She did not know what to answer him. He looked intently at the princess, and with sadness in his voice, asked her not to lie to him. Alexia looked at the prince and asked if she would believe him if she told him he asked why she had called him. He did not understand why she had decided to call him and not a spy from her kingdom. She sighed heavily and said that it was all because he himself said that he would protect her. The prince asked her furiously if she was joking. Now he shouted that if it wasn't a joke, she wouldn't say such a thing now. He shouted that all he had now was the title of prince. He shouted that he couldn't even think that she would want to run away. She sighed heavily and said that she knew everything because she was needed here to save the prince. She said that it was not that she was saved, but on the contrary, she was caught as a criminal who was on the run. She knew that everything was right, and she should not misunderstand him because she was not meant for her at all. She understood perfectly well that if it weren't for that situation, she would never have met him. The princess said that he searched the entire forest with the frightening thought that she had been kidnapped. He was shocked because that spy had spent a lot of effort to hide the traces of the hideout. The prince was furious and did not understand what she could do for the sake of her homeland. He knew it wasn't about her country, and she wasn't having an affair with a spy, and he wasn't even her relative, but she still followed him. He asked in a dull voice if she really wanted him to believe something like that. She sighed heavily and looked away. The princess said it was all for her mother. She said that she had heard that her mother had been poisoned, and all she could think of was that she needed to see her urgently. She looked at the prince intently and said that was exactly why. He looked at her closely and asked if she had run around to see the already dead body. The princess froze in shock on the spot. He looked at her intently and said sadly that he was talking about the fact that her mother was already dead. The prince looked at her in bewilderment as he saw that she was starting to have a panic attack. The young lady was in shock. She could not believe what she had just heard. She screamed and called for her mother. The prince looked at her with fury and asked if he had not warned her not to even think of lying to him. The young lady glanced sideways at the prince. She was in shock as she had no idea that her mother was dead. He looked at the princess with pity and asked if she really didn't know about this. She was in shock and wondered when her mother died and why. The prince froze in place in surprise as he saw that she knew nothing about it. The young lady was in shock. She just couldn't believe what had happened. She asked the prince when she died yesterday morning or last night. She screamed that if she had a little more time, she would have definitely saved her. She froze in shock and wondered if she was alone now. The princess wondered if she could have saved her mother. She knew she didn't have the strength to do it. She knew she could hardly do anything for her mother. The prince looked closely at the young lady and calmly said that before she came here, she was told that she was dead. She looked at the prince in surprise, and he said that everything was true before she came to Oberon. With tears in her eyes, she screamed hysterically that this was simply ridiculous. She could not believe how this could happen. She wondered if that day was the last time she saw her mother alive. She was in shock and just didn't understand anything. Alexia couldn't accept the fact that her mother was dead. Only one thing came to her mind. Treason was in shock. He screamed and called for the princess because he saw that she was hysterical. He shouted that she had to wake up and come to her senses. The priest looked closely at the princess and said that she should breathe slowly. He looked at her and said that everything would be fine. But she in turn understood perfectly well that nothing would be fine anymore. She knew that nothing would help her anymore. She was in shock because she never thought that she would ever lose her mother. The prince sat quietly by the young lady's bedside. Ludwig approached the prince and called him. He looked at him intently and asked if he had not been informed. Ludwig looked at the prince and said that the king had killed her mother without telling her. He looked at the princess and said that he thought she had decided to come here after her death. Ludwig told the prince that he seemed not to know about it. He asked the prince not to worry. The prince quietly asked how the funeral of the princess's mother had gone. Ludwig sighed heavily and said that it had been rather modest. Ludwig looked at the prince and said that the body had been buried outside the palace. The prince told him that he was ordering him to find out where that place was. Tervion slowly approached the princess, and with tenderness in his voice, called Alexia. He sighed heavily and said that a similar king was not the best father, as he was originally imagined. The prince said in anger that he was so terrible that he was simply not worthy of even being called a father. The emperor looked at his son intently and asked him angrily why he had killed the knights. He shouted that he must answer him immediately and that he must not make him wait too long. The boy with tears in his eyes screamed that he did it unintentionally, since he could not control his power. The emperor was furious. He screamed at his son not to lie to him. He shouted at his son that he had killed the knights on purpose. The emperor shouted that he was not so stupid as to believe him. Tervion S. screamed with tears in his eyes that he really did not do it on purpose. The emperor screamed that it could not have been an ordinary accident. The emperor shouted that he knew it all, and that it was simply inevitable. He shouted that he was to blame for everything. The emperor looked at his son with fury and shouted that he was no longer his son, but a monster. He pointed his sword at the little boy. The emperor shouted that if he killed him right now, he would prevent the murders he would commit in the future. Tervion looked at his father with tears in his eyes and called him, but it was all in vain. The man slowly approached the emperor and asked him to wait a little and not to rush. The emperor looked at Ludwig with fury and asked if he had not ordered him to keep quiet. Ludwig looked at the emperor and said that it was true that it was not done intentionally. He said that he thought he should not make a rash decision. Temperature looked at the knight in surprise and asked why he was saying all this. He said that he thought it would be better to send him to the demons rather than kill him. The emperor thought for a moment, but he did not know where to send him. Ludwig bowed and told the emperor that he could send him to the Oberon forest. The emperor looked at the knight in surprise and asked if he really meant that forest with monsters. The boy froze in shock on the spot. Ludwig looked at the little prince intently, for he knew that if the emperor did this, the prince would remain alive. He said that he thought it would be quite useful, for they had sent knights there countless times before, and none had survived. The emperor listened to the knight's opinion, and the little defenseless prince was sent into the forest. The emperor ordered the knights to make sure that he could enter the forest, but would never be able to leave. The knights looked at the prince with disdain, and a moment later they pushed him over the cliff. In the end, the prince managed to survive there. He was just very lucky. The man found a defenseless little boy lying quietly. There, he met other people who were similarly thrown out there just like him. He thought that if he hadn't met them, there he would have definitely died. At that moment, he was incredibly angry with his father. However, at that turning point, he met a young lady who helped him a lot. The prince looked at the princess and asked her to wake up quickly. He looked at her and said that if she only wished, he would immediately behead the king. A moment later, Ludwig informed the prince that the king's army had arrived and that he should go out to meet them. The prince sighed heavily as he realized that those nasty dogs had decided to arrive first. The prince looked at his friend and asked him to stay next to the princess. Ludwig said that he would do everything. The prince looked at the princess and asked his friend not to leave her for a moment while he was not with her. The prince sighed heavily and said that it seemed that the king's army had arrived. He was very sorry that he had not been able to kill his brother, and the plan to seize the estate had also failed. He knew that now everything should be left to the king. He looked at his subordinate and said that his mother had indeed played her role well. The man said that he had heard that the king's army was hostile. The prince wondered if his brother would chicken out. He wondered if it was all worth it to get just one kingdom. The man looked at the prince and said that, most likely, he just wanted to take over the kingdom and the princess. The prince said that the woman would definitely be punished and would not be able to escape it. He knew that the punishment would not be easy, and most likely she would be executed. He said he needed to see the king's army before his brother did. The king's personal servant introduced himself and greeted the prince. The prince looked at the man with fury and said that it seemed that it had been difficult for him to make this long journey. He hesitated and said that it was not so. But a moment later, he froze in place. He saw another prince and greeted him. The young man looked at them intently and said, "You have a letter of order from the emperor. Jubilian looked at his brother with a grin and said that it looked like the monster had played himself out. Turvion looked askance at his brother and asked if he was really talking about himself. He looked at his brother and said with a grin that he thought he was still sleeping. Jubilian looked at his brother with anger and surprise and asked if he was unhappy that he was still alive. Turvion Gray looked at his brother and said that it seemed like the truth was poking him in the eye. He told his brother to stop barking like a dog, as his vulgar habit of treating his brother with disrespect had not gone away. He said that he is still his brother. He said that he is just a dog, Empress, but he controls his life dream. They quarreled among themselves for some time, while the messenger stood and watched them closely. The young man looked at them intently and asked if he could already convey the order to His Majesty. Turvion sighed heavily and asked what his orders were. A moment later, the young man began to read the order. He looked at them intently and said that they should both go to the capital, so since they both made a mistake, they would be punished. Turvion looked at the young man in surprise and asked if they were both in trouble. Jubilian was in shock, and he could not understand what he had done. The young man looked at the prince and asked for forgiveness, saying that he could not know this. Turvion was furious, because no one revealed the reasons for their punishment. He did not understand what was happening. The prince sighed heavily, for he knew that, depending on the gravity of his offense, the empress might be held accountable. He knew that this was a clear threat. He looked at his brother and said that it looked like they were both in danger. Turvion said that it was incredible to admit it, but it was true. The young man looked at them intently and said that it was not only the names of the princes that were mentioned. He said that the princess should also go with them. The prince looked at him intently and with fury said that this was out of the question. The young man looked at the prince in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The princess looked at him and said that this was out of the question. Jubilian looked sideways at his brother and told him not to even ask him for help. Turvion told his brother that he could protect her himself, and it didn't concern him at all. The young man looked at the prince and said that the words they had spoken could put him in great danger. He looked at the prince intently and asked if he shouldn't be happy that he would be able to meet the king. The prince looked at the young man with anger. He said that he would be very glad to meet him. Jubilian said that if they publicized the princess's misdeed, they could start a war again. They discussed this situation for some time, as they wanted to find a way out of it. The prince grinned at his brother and said that it looked like he needed to step away. The young man looked closely at the princes. He guessed that this would not be easy to accomplish. The prince entered the new room and asked his friend how the princess was feeling. Ludwig looked at the prince and said that Hans said that she was born very weak, so the improvements so far are minimal. The prince looked closely at the young lady. He hoped that rest would help her recover. He slowly approached the princess as he saw that she was exposed. Turvion with tenderness. Covering the princess, the butler looked intently at the prince. Ludwig looked at the prince with a smile, as he found it amusing to watch such a thing considering what kind of person the prince was. The prince asked if something strange had happened between his brother and Rein while he was gone, and the butler said that nothing new had happened. The prince told his friend to stay close to the princess as he had to leave. Ludwig asked if he had decided to give up his work completely. The prince sighed heavily and said that it was the king's order. Ludwig looked at the prince and said that it looked like he was planning to take the initiative in managing the castle himself. Turvion sighed and said that he was very afraid that the war would start again. The prince looked at his friend and asked if he remembered what the king had said when he survived and returned to the palace. He said that of course he remembered it. He said that he didn't think anyone remembered it, but he was very sorry that the king had wanted him dead so much. He said that this was his only chance to get out of the forest, and there weren't many chances. He said that if he had delayed a little and come out later, the king would have gladly killed him. Ludwig looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he was talking about this now. The prince said in a fury that he would destroy all of Harbekia. Following the king, he shouted that he would definitely do it. The butler froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear anything like that. He looked at his friend intently and said that he would soon have to live up to his title as a monster's. Ludwig shouted at the prince not to say such a thing. Turvion told his friend that his father was very angry with him. He smiled softly, looking at his friend, and asked if he would be by his side, even though he was a monster. Ludwig looked at the prince intently. He already knew his answer in advance. A moment later, Ludwig knelt before the prince and said that he would naturally be by his side. Opening her eyes, the young lady realized that she was having the same dream again. She stared at the words in front of her. She was puzzled, did not understand what they meant. The young lady slowly extended her hand towards the words as if she wanted to touch them. She froze in shock as someone suddenly pulled her. She saw her sister in front of her. Ophelia looked at her sister intently and said that no one has the power to change the plot of the novel. Alexia was in shock. She woke up and realized that she was in the forest. She was in shock and breathing heavily. She was told that she would not be able to change her destiny. She was in shock and screamed that she didn't want to die. She didn't want to disappear from this place. With tears in her eyes, she called the prince. The prince shouted and asked the young lady to open her eyes quickly. She woke up with horror. She looked at him with a piercing gaze. Some time later, the prince tenderly sat her down on the bed. Hugging the young lady, he asked if she was okay. He saw her condition. She looked at him timidly, but did not answer. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he asked her something like that. He said that she suddenly screamed and then began to loudly call his name. She froze in shock as she realized that she had been screaming even in reality. He hugged her tenderly and asked if she was in pain. He said that she should be patient for a little while and that he would call a doctor right away. She said that she was not in pain. She had just had a very scary dream. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not need to worry so much. He smiled softly at her and said that they were no longer in the forest. She sat on the bed, breathing heavily, and said nothing to him. He said that the idea should already be better. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was here. The prince said that this was his room too. The prince looked at the servant and asked if the doctor had arrived. The young man said that he would find out everything now. Treason looked at the young lady and asked if she was okay. Now she said she was okay. He looked at the princess intently and said that it was a lie. She looked at him in bewilderment, but did not answer. She turned away from him because she knew that even if she wasn't okay, she didn't know if they needed to talk about it. She knew her mom was dead and she wasn't safe. She sighed heavily and said that she was fine and that he shouldn't worry. He sighed heavily and said sadly that he had been informed that her mother had been buried outside the palace and not in the royal cemetery. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked intently at the nth lady and said that after the war was over, he would take her there. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the prince and said that it was all in vain. She wanted her mother to always be by her side. She was in shock and screamed that it was all in vain. The prince looked at the princess with pity. He did not know what to do in this situation. She screamed that she came here with the thought that this would help save her mother. She screamed and wondered if this was her destiny. She wondered if nothing could be changed. She screamed that she just didn't have the courage to run away because she left her mother alone. She knew that while her mother was alive, she had no chance to escape, but she still tried. And in the end, everything went wrong. He looked at her hard and said that it wasn't so. She screamed that if she had sat still, her mother would still be alive. She screamed that it seemed that because of her disobedience, people treated her mother badly, and this led to her death. The prince sighed heavily and said that this was not so. With tears in her eyes, she wondered if she even had the right to mourn her death. The prince looked at her closely and said that she was at dawn. The carriage had arrived. It was the carriage that the girl had been waiting for all night. The owner of the carriage had gone into the castle to pick up the trash. The sun had not yet set, so it was dark everywhere. The girl was just as dark as night, and yet she had only to walk quietly to the carriage and silently drive away. And then she opened the door. A foul smell hit her nose, but she was unwavering in her decision to endure even this. The opportunity to escape was important to her, but unfortunately, the girl never got into the crew. Until dawn came, she walked swiftly towards him, ready to sit down. But in the end, she did not climb into him, but ran away. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked how he knew about it. He said that the girl who was running away said that she didn't want to leave her mother alone. At that time, he couldn't understand why she was telling him this. He only knew that she decided to stay and not go for the sake of her mother. The prince looked at the young lady tenderly. He knew that she would understand everything. Her favorite place was always the rose garden. She would quietly watch the roses when no one was looking. She saw the maids discussing her. They said that she was the only one of the princesses who behaved like this. They did not know why. She sat quietly and listened to them as they spoke, so that all the maids tried to avoid her. They knew that although she was a member of the royal family, she did not possess magic. At that time, she really had no magic or family love. While running away, she accidentally tripped and fell to the ground with a crash. Ophelia looked into the distance in surprise and told her father that there was someone there. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry as much as they had when they were alone. She ran up to the young lady and asked if she could help her. Alexia reached out to her, but a moment later, she shouted at her not to come near her. Ophelia froze in place in surprise as the young lady hit her hard on the arm. The young lady was taken aback. She looked at her sister and said that she didn't mean to do it. She screamed and asked her for forgiveness, and ran away with the speed of lightning. She sat quietly while no one was looking. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew her father was laughing at her. She was puzzled as her sister had beautiful clothes and smelled wonderful. A moment later, she looked into the distance because she heard some noise. She looked intently at the young man, not understanding what was going on at all.